Warren Blackwell rode onto Red Willow Ranch like he owned it, which, the way he talked, he figured was only a matter of time. He didn't dismount so much as he descended, handing his reins to nobody because he assumed somebody would take them. Then he looked straight at Silas Mercer, who was setting a post into hard ground 30 feet away, and said it loud enough for the 3 ranch hands nearby to hear every word. "How much does Harlan pay a man your age to dig holes?" Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word. Silas straightened up slow, dirt on both hands, sweat cutting lines through the dust on his face, and he looked at Warren Blackwell the way a man looks at weather he can't do anything about. Then Eliza Whitlock's voice came from behind the barn, sharp and clear as a rifle crack. "About as much as my father pays men who can actually finish what they start." Warren turned, Silas didn't. And that was the moment, that exact, ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday morning when everything Silas Mercer believed about himself, about what he deserved, about the invisible fence he'd spent 40 years building around his own life, began to come apart at the posts. If you've ever told yourself you were too old, too poor, too late, or just plain too much of what you are, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end, because this one goes places I promise you won't see coming. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it hits you somewhere real, leave a like. It costs nothing, and it means everything. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Silas Mercer turned 39 in March of 1883 with no ceremony and no cake, because there was no one around who knew the date and he saw no reason to mention it. He ate salt pork and cold biscuits in the bunkhouse at Red Willow Ranch, the same bunkhouse he'd slept in for going on 3 years, and he thought about the fact that he'd now been working other men's land for 20 years without accumulating much beyond a good horse, a reliable saddle, a bedroll that had seen better decades, and a reputation. The reputation was the part that kept him employed. Silas Mercer did not steal, he did not drink on the job. He did not lie to the man paying his wages about how much work had gotten done that day, and he did not start fights, though he'd finished a few when finishing them was unavoidable. Harlan Whitlock, who owned Red Willow and 1,200 acres of the Texas scrub surrounding it, had hired Silas away from an outfit outside Abilene after hearing 2 different men describe him the same way, dependable. That word had fed Silas for 20 years. He'd learned not to want more than it could buy. Red Willow was a working cattle ranch, not glamorous, not vast by the standards of the barons, who were starting to consolidate land across the territory, but honest. Harlan ran about 400 head, employed 6 hands including Silas, and managed his property the way a man manages something he intends to pass on. He was 61, weathered down to something close to rawhide, and he had 1 child, a daughter named Eliza, who had come back from 3 years east of the Mississippi with books Silas couldn't name and opinions she didn't bother softening for anyone's comfort. Silas had seen her around the ranch property twice before that Tuesday morning in April once when she arrived back from wherever she'd been, climbing down from a buggy with 2 trunks of luggage and an expression that said she'd already assessed everything and found it acceptable but not impressive. And once when he'd been fixing a water trough near the main house, and she'd walked past without looking at him. He hadn't thought much about either occasion. Women who lived in main houses were a different category of person from men who slept in bunkhouses. That was a rule Silas had learned young and never found a reason to argue with. Then came the fence post on the eastern pasture. He'd been working the far line that week, walking it section by section the way Harlan preferred, checking for rot and lean and places where the cattle had been testing the wire. It was slow work and mostly solitary, which suited Silas fine. He didn't require company. He had Bramble, a 15-year-old roan, gelding with a stubborn streak and the best instincts of any horse Silas had ever ridden, and he had the work itself, which at least had the virtue of being honest about what it needed. He was crouching over a post on the southeast corner when he heard hoofbeats coming from the direction of the main house. He didn't look up immediately. He was looking at the base of the post, where the wood met the ground, and what he was seeing there was not good. Is that one rotten? He looked up then. Eliza Whitlock had pulled her horse to a stop about 6 feet away and was looking down at the post with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than the kind of polite interest a rancher's daughter performs when she's supposed to look engaged. Silas stood up. He considered briefly whether to soften the answer. Then he decided against it. Rotted through at the base, he said. The wood above the ground looks fine, which is why nobody caught it sooner. But below the surface, it's been going for a while. Another hard storm in this corner comes down. She looked at the post. Then she looked at him. My father had a hand walk this line 2 months ago. Yes, ma'am, and he didn't catch it. No, ma'am. Why not? Silas thought about that. The honest answer was that the hand in question, a young man named Cutter, who'd since moved on, had been the type who walked fast and looked like he was paying attention. But Silas didn't think speaking poorly of a man who wasn't there to defend himself was particularly useful. It takes time to look right, he said. Most people look at what's visible. She was quiet for a moment. Her horse shifted, and she stilled it with her knee without looking down at it, which told Silas she was a better rider than she needed to be. How many others like this? Found 3 in this section. There may be more, and you're going to tell my father. Already wrote it down. I'll give him the paper tonight. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've gotten the answer they expected but weren't sure they'd receive. Then she turned her horse and rode back toward the main house, and Silas went back to looking at the post, and that was the end of it. Except that it wasn't. She came back the next Thursday. Different section of the fence line, farther north, and she arrived with a question about whether the wire gauge on the eastern boundary was consistent with what the hands were using for repairs, which was an unusually specific question for a woman who'd been away from the ranch for 3 years. Silas answered it, straight and plain. She listened the way people listen when they're actually filing the information away, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. She came back the Thursday after that, too. By the 3rd week, Silas had started being aware of a sound he hadn't been listening for, the specific cadence of her horse's hoofbeats coming across the pasture. And that awareness bothered him considerably, because he was 39 years old and he'd spent 2 decades being a man who did not reach for things he had no business reaching for. The morning Warren Blackwell first rode onto Red Willow property was a Friday in early May. Silas had seen men like Warren before, men who had been wealthy long enough that wealth had rearranged the way they moved through the world, so that every gesture carried the assumption of deference. Warren was 42, with a broad, not unpleasant face and clothes that were expensive without being showy, which was actually a more dangerous kind of wealth than the flashy sort. Flashy wealth was a performance. Quiet wealth was a statement of fact. He came with 2 of his own men riding behind him, which was not necessary for a social call, but which established, without a word being spoken, that he was a man who did not travel alone unless he chose to. Harlan came out of the main house to meet him at the gate, and there was warmth in the greeting, not the warmth of close friends, but the warmth of 2 men who respected each other's position. Silas was working on the gate latch 20 yards away and had no reason to stop working, so he didn't. He heard Warren laugh at something Harlan said. He heard the mention of cattle prices, which were everyone's conversation that spring. He kept his eyes on the latch and his hands doing what hands are supposed to do when they're supposed to be working. Then Warren turned his head and saw him and said what he said. How much does Harlan pay a man your age to dig holes? The words landed differently than an insult usually lands. An insult from a loud man in a saloon has a kind of simplicity to it. This was something more precise. It was a categorization. Warren Blackwell was not trying to wound Silas Mercer. He was not thinking about Silas Mercer at all. He was simply identifying what he saw, a man of no consequence performing a task of no significance, who existed in the same category as the post Silas was working on and the dirt beneath his boots. That was the worst part. Not malice, dismissal. Silas straightened up slow. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't either embarrass Harlan or make Silas look like exactly the kind of man Warren already thought he was. Then Eliza's voice came from behind the barn, sharp. Level, no heat in it, which somehow made it worse for Warren than heat would have. Warren turned toward her with an expression that tried to rearrange itself into something charming. Eliza walked past him without pausing and stopped in front of Silas. She looked at the latch. She looked at his hands. "You almost done with this?" she asked. Her voice was the same voice she used when she asked about fence posts. "Yes, ma'am," Silas said. "Another 10 minutes. Good." She handed him something, a canteen, he realized, because she pushed it into his hands before he'd registered what it was. "You've been out here since before breakfast." Then she turned and walked back toward the main house, greeting her father, not looking at Warren, and leaving the kind of silence behind her that has more words in it than most conversations. Silas went back to the latch. He drank from the canteen because it would have been stranger not to, and because he was in fact thirsty. But his hands weren't quite steady. Warren Blackwell started coming to Red Willow every Friday. It became a fact of the week the way weather becomes a fact. You don't choose it, you account for it. He brought gifts sometimes, once a bolt of good cloth for Eliza, which she accepted politely and did not appear to look at again. Once a catalog from a furniture maker in Dallas, which Harlan studied with what looked like genuine interest. Once unforgettably, 2 hunting dogs he claimed were championship stock, which Eliza admired briefly and then turned loose in the south pasture to terrorize the cattle. Silas watched all of this from the middle distance where ranch hands exist, close enough to see, but far enough to remain invisible, and he told himself several things he had always found reliable. He told himself that Warren was an objectively better prospect for a woman like Eliza than a 40-year-old ranch hand, with a horse, a bedroll, and a reputation for being dependable. He told himself that feelings were not the same as rights, and that wanting something did not entitle a person to it. He told himself that the conversations he'd been having with Eliza along the fence lines were the conversations a rancher's daughter has with the help practical informational, meaning nothing beyond their stated content. He believed approximately none of this. Because something had happened in those Thursday afternoon conversations that Silas didn't have good language for, being a man who had spent 20 years around cattle and very little time thinking about what he felt. She asked him questions that assumed he had thoughts worth hearing. Not about cattle or fence wire, those came first, and they were real questions she actually wanted answered. But then sometimes, when the light was going and there was no particular reason to keep talking, the questions changed. "Do you think a person can want 2 things that cancel each other out?" she'd asked him once, out of nowhere, staring at the middle distance, where the pasture flattened toward the tree line. Silas had thought about it. "Probably most people want exactly that," he said. "Most of the time. And what do you do about it?" "Usually, pick the one you can live with failing at. The other one's already decided for you." She'd looked at him then, with an expression he couldn't read and hadn't tried to. He was trying now. Weeks later, alone in the bunkhouse after the other hands had gone to sleep, listening to the sound of bramble shifting in the stall outside. He was trying to read that expression from memory, and he was succeeding well enough that it was causing him a considerable amount of difficulty. A hired hand who owned almost nothing, a woman whose father had 1,200 acres, and a wealthy suitor who came every Friday with gifts. The math was not complicated. What was complicated was that Eliza had started bringing him coffee. Not to the bunkhouse, to the pasture, in the early morning, before the other hands were out. Black, no sugar, in an old tin cup from the main house kitchen. She'd hand it to him without ceremony, the way you hand something to a person whose preferences you already know, and she'd known his preferences because she'd been paying attention. And the fact that she'd been paying attention was the thing Silas kept coming back to in the dark of the bunkhouse. He had spent 20 years being invisible to people who lived in main houses. Eliza Whitlock had been watching him the way you watch something that matters to you. He lay in the dark and felt the specific weight of that, and felt the familiar hand of practicality pressing it back down, and felt the weight push back against the hand, and knew with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has spent decades reading signs, he doesn't like that this situation was going to force a choice he was not ready to make. He was not young, he was not wealthy, he was not wrong about the math. But she had ridden 3 fence lines in 3 weeks and started bringing him coffee before sunrise, and Eliza Whitlock, in Silas's experience, did not do things without reasons. That was the thing keeping him awake, not hope. He was too old and too practical for hope. But something that lived right next to it, wearing the same face. And it scared him considerably more than Warren Blackwell ever could. The coffee had been sitting on the fence post for 10 minutes before Silas touched it. He'd seen her ride up. He always saw her ride up now, which was itself the problem. He'd started listening for the sound of her horse, the way a man listens for rain when he's got hay drying in the field. That kind of attention meant something, and Silas knew what it meant. And knowing what it meant was why he was taking longer than necessary to finish tightening the wire on this particular section of fence that didn't actually need this much attention. Eliza didn't say anything. She set the tin cup on the nearest post and watched him work. He reached for it finally, because refusing it would have required explaining why he was refusing it, and he didn't have an explanation that didn't sound like what it was. "You've been avoiding this section," she said. "I've been working north to south." "Same as always. You've been working north to south except for the last 2 weeks, when you've been working around it." He drank the coffee. It was exactly right black, just off boiling the way he drank it. He set the cup back on the post. "I had other sections that needed attention first," he said. "Silas." He looked at her then, because she'd said his name with a particular kind of flatness that meant she was done accepting the surface of a conversation. "What?" he said. "I'm not asking about the fence." The morning light was still low and orange, the kind of light that makes everything look more significant than it is, and Silas was acutely aware of that fact, and equally aware that it wasn't doing all the work here. Eliza had her horse standing easy, 6 feet away, her hands loose in her lap, and she was watching him with the same expression she used when she was waiting for a straight answer about a rotten post. "Miss Whitlock, don't," she said. "You've been calling me that for 4 weeks. Before that you called me Eliza. Before that I wasn't." He stopped. "Wasn't what?" He picked up the wire stretcher again because his hands needed somewhere to be. "Your father has a man coming every Friday," he said. "Respectable man. Good land, good standing. I know who Warren Blackwell is." "Then you know what he represents." "I know what my father thinks he represents," Eliza said. "That's a different thing." Silas set the wire stretcher down. He turned and looked at her directly, because she deserved that much even if it was uncomfortable, and said, "I'm a hired hand. I own a horse, a saddle, and a bedroll that's got more years on it than some of the hands working this ranch. I sleep in a bunkhouse. I don't have land. I don't have savings worth mentioning." I didn't ask you what you have," she said. "I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway, because someone ought to." She was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark called somewhere in the brush 50 yards off, and the sound of it sat in the silence between them like a third party to the conversation. "Warren Blackwell," Eliza said finally, "told me last Friday that he'd been thinking about where to put the new parlor. She let that land. He's been to Red Willow 4 times. He hasn't asked me a question yet. Not one. He talks at me about what he's planning and waits for me to look pleased. He's a wealthy man trying to impress a woman," Silas said. "That's not a character flaw." "No," she said, "but it tells me something about what he thinks impressing a woman looks like." She picked up the tin cup from the fence post and turned it in her hands. "You've told me things I didn't want to hear every single time I've ridden out here. You told me the fence crew missed 3 bad posts. You told me the water table near the south pastures is probably dropping. You told me the numbers my father gave you, for the herd didn't match what you counted." She looked at him. "You know what Warren Blackwell would have done with any of those things?" "Made them sound like opportunities," Silas said before he could stop himself. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than that. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. "I want to look at the South Pasture waterline. I think you're right about the table dropping, and I want to see for myself." She turned her horse and rode back toward the house. Silas stood there for a while with the wire stretcher in one hand and what was left of his logic in the other, and neither one felt particularly useful. He went back to work. He worked the rest of that day and through the following morning with the kind of determined focus that is less about the work itself and more about keeping certain thoughts from having enough silence to move around in. He fixed 3 sections of wire that didn't urgently need fixing. He rechecked 2 posts he'd already confirmed were solid. He found himself, at one point, recoiling the same length of wire he'd already coiled, which was when he put it down and admitted to himself that he was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that announces itself, the quiet kind. The kind that settles into a man's bones while he's looking at something else. He had been alone for most of his adult life, not dramatically alone, not the tortured romantic kind of alone that people in books seem to find noble. Just practically alone. He'd had company at various points, the kind of company you find when you're a working man, moving between outfits and towns and seasons, and some of it had been good company, and he didn't regret any of it particularly. But he'd learned, somewhere around his early 30s, that the version of his life that included another person in any permanent way required that other person to accept certain realities: no land, no house, no security of the kind that a woman deserved. He was not the kind of man who dressed those facts up in possibilities. He knew what he had and what he didn't. Eliza Whitlock knew it too, and was apparently unimpressed by its relevance, which was the most unsettling thing about her. Warren came that Friday with a surveyor's map. Silas wasn't meant to see it, but he was on the porch of the equipment shed when Warren spread it on the hood of his buggy to show Harlan, and the wind was flat that day and voices carry. It was a map of property adjacent to Red Willow undeveloped land, roughly 300 acres, between the eastern fence and the creek. Warren had outlined it in red. Contiguous parcels, Warren was saying, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man describing things that are already his in everything but paperwork. Combine them with Red Willow, and you've got one of the strongest operations in this county. The grazing alone doubles. Harlan had his arms crossed and was studying the map with his head tilted to one side. He didn't say anything. Immediately, a man would want to see his daughter settled well, Warren said. Not as a pressure, as a fact, as a thing everyone already understood and which required no argument. Silas went inside the equipment shed and started doing inventory that wasn't scheduled until the following week. He didn't hear Harlan's response. He told himself he didn't want to. He counted bolts and coils of wire and came up with the same number twice, and then a different number a third time, and he put his pencil down and stood in the dark of the shed with dust floating in the single shaft of light coming through the high window, and he thought about 300 acres outlined in red on a map. That was the shape of a future. That was what a father looked at when he was thinking about his daughter's life. That was real and rational, and Silas had no version of that conversation. He had no map to spread on a buggy hood. He had no adjacent parcels. He had no argument. What he had was a bedroll and 20 years of being dependable, and right at that moment it seemed like exactly what it was, not enough. He started working harder. It was not a plan exactly. It was more like what happens when a man doesn't know what else to do, and doing nothing is intolerable. He started arriving at the equipment shed before sunrise to organize what had been disordered since before he'd come to Red Willow. He found wood rot in 2 of the outbuilding walls that nobody had addressed in years and addressed it. He repaired the latch on the main gate so that it worked with one hand rather than 2, which sounds trivial until you've spent 3 years fighting a gate in the rain with your arms full. Then he built the shelves. There was a room off the main hallway of the house, a kind of storage room, half full of crates and old harness, and 2 broken chairs that nobody had gotten around to throwing out that Harlan had mentioned once, in passing. He'd been meaning to fit with shelves for the books Eliza had brought back from back east. He'd been meaning to do it for 2 months. It hadn't gotten done because ranch work was always more urgent than storage shelves, and there was always something more urgent than the thing before it. Silas asked Harlan's permission on a Sunday morning, when the other hands were off and Harlan was drinking coffee on the main house steps. He asked it plainly. He had post-oak lumber from a repair project that had left him with clean pieces, and he had time on Sunday afternoons, and if Harlan had no objection, he'd like to build those shelves properly rather than use the leftover pine that was warping in the shed. Harlan looked at him over his coffee cup for a moment. Not long, just a beat. Post-oak's heavy work, Harlan said. Yes, sir. I know how to do it right. Another pause. All right, Harlan said, and looked back at the pasture. That was all. But something in that pause was not nothing, and Silas knew it, and filed it under the category of things he was not going to let himself think about too directly. He spent 3 Sunday afternoons on those shelves. Mortise and tenon joints, because they were the right way to do it, and because Silas, when he decided to do something, did not do it badly on purpose. He fitted the pieces with the kind of patience the job deserved. He leveled them 3 times. He sanded the surfaces until they no longer had the roughness of working wood, but something closer to the texture of something finished, something intended to last. Eliza walked in on the second Sunday and stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. That's post-oak, she said finally. Yes, ma'am. Those are mortise joints. Yes. She was quiet again. She came inside and ran her fingers along the edge of the shelf nearest her, the way you touch something when you want to understand how it was made. She didn't look at him while she did it. My father has been talking about these shelves for 2 months, she said. I know, he mentioned it. He mentioned it to you? In passing. She turned and looked at him then, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't seen before, not the sharp, appraising look she used for questions, not the flat patience she used when she was waiting for honesty. Something quieter, something that made Silas look back at the shelf he was fitting, because some things are difficult to receive head-on. Silas, she said, soft the way she'd said it that morning at the fence. Why are you working 7 days a week? I've got work to do. You've been doing work that isn't yours to do. The gate latch. The south outbuilding these shelves. She paused. Is this because of Warren? He set down his mallet. The honest answer was yes in the way that it was, and no in the way that it was also not. He wasn't building shelves to compete with Warren Blackwell. He wasn't fixing gate latches to prove something against a man who had 300 acres outlined in red on a surveyor's map. He couldn't compete with that, and he knew it, and he wasn't trying to. He was building because it was the only language he had. He didn't say any of that. I'm doing work that needed doing, he said. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked out of the room, and her footsteps went down the hall and out the front door, and Silas picked up his mallet and went back to work and didn't let himself think about the expression that had been on her face. That night, lying in the bunkhouse with the other 3 hands snoring in various registers, he did something he rarely did. He did the accounting, not a formal accounting, just the kind a man does in the dark when he's being honest with himself about the specific shape of his situation. He was 39. He had maybe another 25 working years in him, before the body started charging interest on every hard thing he'd asked of it. He had no land. He had no savings that amounted to anything ranch hands in 1,000. 883 did not accumulate wealth. They accumulated experience and calluses, and only one of those things paid in a marketplace. He had Bramble, who was 15 and would not be ridden forever. Against that, he could work. He could build. He had never lied to a man who trusted him. He had never left a job unfinished without reason. He knew cattle, land, water, weather, and the particular stubbornness of fence wire and cold ground. He knew, it turned out, how to build a set of shelves that a woman ran her fingers along to understand how they were made. That was the inventory. That was all of it. He put it against Warren's map, and he did not like the result of that comparison, and he fell asleep sometime after midnight and dreamed nothing he could remember. The confrontation he had not been planning for came on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the shelves were finished. He was at the creek, not the fence line, just the actual creek that ran along the south edge of the property, where he'd been watching the water line for signs that the table was continuing to drop. It was real work, practical work, nothing to do with anything except the health of the ranch's water supply. He had his boots off because the bank was muddy and he didn't ruin boots unnecessarily, and he was crouching at the edge of the water, marking the water line against a stake he'd driven in the previous week. He heard her coming and didn't look up, because looking up immediately would tell her something he was still trying not to tell. She dismounted and tied her horse and came to stand beside him at the creek's edge, and she looked at the stake and the water line, and she said, "It dropped 3 inches. 3.5, he said, in 1 week. That's worse than you thought. Yes, you need to tell my father. I plan to tonight." She crouched down beside him, not beside him the way a woman stands at a polite distance, but actually beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off her arm, and she looked at the water line for a moment, and then she looked at him. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it like you answered me about the fence posts. Not the way you think I want it answered." He looked at her. "Do you actually believe," she said, "that the right thing for me is Warren Blackwell?" The question hit him the way cold water hits, not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore and impossible to look calm receiving. "I think," he said carefully, "that what I believe about that isn't relevant." "I didn't ask what's relevant. I asked what you believe." Silas sat back on his heels and looked at the creek. A water strider moved across the surface near the opposite bank, skating on the skin of the water with complete indifference to the conversation happening 3 feet away, and Silas envied it briefly and profoundly. "No," he said. "I don't believe it." Eliza said nothing for a moment. "Why not?" she said. "Because you're not a parcel of land to be combined with adjacent parcels," he said. "And that's how he talks about you, not to your face." "But that's how he talks." She was very still. "You heard him," she said. "I was in the equipment shed. I wasn't listening on purpose." "No," she said. "That's not how you do things." She stood up slowly and brushed the mud from the hem of her skirt in a practical, unself-conscious way that had nothing of performance in it. "Silas, I need to tell you something." He stood too. "I know what you're doing," she said. "The gate, the outbuildings, the shelves. I know why you're doing it." He started to say something. She raised a hand. "I'm not finished," she said. "I know why you're doing it, and I know it's not because you think it will change anything. I think you're doing it because you can't figure out what else to do with what you're feeling, and because you're the kind of man who can't feel something and do nothing, so you do something useful instead." She looked at him straight. "Am I wrong?" He should have said yes. He could feel the shape of the yes, the safe, practical, appropriate yes, that would put things back where they belonged and keep the morning from becoming something he couldn't undo. "No," he said, "you're not wrong." The silence that followed was different from the silences they'd had before. Those had been companionable, the silence of 2 people who didn't require constant noise between them. This was the silence of something that has been said and cannot be unsaid, sitting in the air between 2 people who are both measuring what to do with it. "I care about you," he said, and the plainness of it surprised him, even as he was saying it, because it was not the language he was comfortable with, and it came out anyway, the way things do when they've been pressing against a door long enough. But caring about you and having a right to act on it are 2 different things. And I don't have the right. I don't have. He made a gesture that was meant to indicate land, property, surveyor's map, the entire concept of what he lacked, and felt it fall short of all those things. "I have nothing to offer you that would be fair." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "Warren Blackwell," she said, "can offer me property. Yes. He can offer me social standing. Yes. He can offer me security of a kind you can't." She tilted her head slightly. "You've thought about all of this." "I've thought about it considerably." "And you've left out one thing," she said. He waited. "You're the only man who has ever offered me the truth," she said. "Not once. Every single time. even when it costs you something. Even when it would have been easier to tell me what I wanted to hear. She took one step toward him, not dramatic, just closing the unnecessary distance between two people having a conversation they both know is important. Do you understand what that's worth to me? Silas understood it. He understood it with perfect clarity, and that clarity was the problem. Because it was exactly the kind of clarity that a practical man in his situation ought to be able to set aside, and he was finding that he couldn't. Eliza, he said, her name, not Miss Whitlock, your father. He's not marrying anyone, she said flatly. He has expectations. He has hopes. Those are different, and they're his, not mine. She looked at him steadily. I'm 28 years old. I went east, and I came back, and I have looked at what my life is supposed to look like, according to everyone who has an opinion about it, and I have a very clear picture of what I don't want. She paused. I'm less clear on what I do want, or I was. Silas stood at the edge of the creek with his boots in one hand, and the most honest conversation he'd had in 20 years still happening around him. And he felt the weight of every practical reason pressing against the specific gravity of this particular moment, and he felt them begin, for the first time in a very long time, to lose. I can't promise you land, he said. I know. I can't promise you what Warren. I know what Warren can promise me, she said. I'm standing here talking to you. That stopped him. She let it stop him. She didn't push. She just stood there at the edge of the creek with mud on her hem and her hands at her sides and waited, with the same patience she'd shown him the first day she asked about the fence house, for him to figure out what he actually needed to say. What came out finally was not what he'd planned. I don't know what I'd be offering you, he said, honestly. I don't know how that looks. Neither do I, she said. And something in her face opened slightly, like a window in a room that's been closed too long. But I know how it doesn't look, and that matters too. He almost said something then. He could feel the shape of it, something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of conversation, one that started from a different premise than the one he'd been working from for 20 years. Then he heard hoofbeats coming from the direction of the main house. It was Harlan. He came at a steady trot, not urgent but purposeful, and he pulled up about 30 feet from the creek and looked at both of them with an expression Silas could not read at all. Not anger, not surprise. Something more like a man who has been watching weather build on the horizon and has come out to see how close it is. Eliza, Harlan said, Warren's ridden in early. Eliza's face didn't change. Tell him I'm checking the water line, she said. I told him that. Then tell him I'll be up when I'm done. Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Silas not the way a man looks at someone he's angry with, but the way a man looks at someone he is trying to take the measure of, carefully, and without the shortcuts that most people use when they measure a ranch hand. The waterline dropping? He asked. 3.5 inches in a week, Silas said. I was going to come to you tonight. You may need to think about supplemental water for the south herd before summer. Harlan nodded slowly. Just the information, just the ranch. He turned his horse toward the house. He stopped after about 20 feet without turning back. Warren brought a lawyer with him today, he said. His voice was even, informational. Nothing in it that Silas could parse with certainty. Paperwork for the adjacent parcel. He rode back to the house. Eliza did not watch him go. She was watching Silas. And Silas was looking at the creek, at the waterline 3.5 inches below where it had been 7 days ago, dropping slowly and steadily and without apology. And he was feeling the particular feeling of a man who has been standing on ground he thought was solid and has just received information that changes his understanding of what's beneath it. Lawyer papers, adjacent parcel. This was no longer a wealthy man courting a woman. This was a transaction being executed, and the people with standing in that transaction were Harlan Whitlock and Warren Blackwell. And Silas Mercer was a ranch hand with mud on his feet who had just told another man's daughter he cared about her at the edge of a failing waterline. He put his boots back on. He did it carefully, because boots went on a certain way, and the mud required a certain amount of attention. and because the act of doing a simple thing carefully was sometimes the only thing between a man and the specific kind of despair that looks exactly like clarity. Eliza was still watching him. "You're going to do it again," she said quietly. "Not a question. Do what? Decide it's not your place. Decide that the math doesn't work. Decide that the right thing is to step back and let things run the way everyone expects them to." He didn't say anything. "I'm not going to stop you," she said. "I'm not going to beg you. That's not how I am, and you know it." She picked up her horse's reins. "But I want you to understand something, Silas. Whatever happens between me and Warren Blackwell, that's a decision I make. Not a decision that gets made by a man who's too convinced of his own worthlessness to fight for anything." She mounted her horse in one clean motion and looked down at him. "The shelves are beautiful," she said, and there was something in her voice that made the words mean more than they were, the way certain simple things do when the person saying them knows exactly what weight they're carrying. She turned and rode back toward the house. Silas stood at the creek and watched her go and felt, in the specific cavity where his decision-making lived, a war beginning between the man he'd trained himself to be and something older and less reasonable that had apparently been waiting around a lot longer than he'd given it credit for. Warren's buggy was visible near the main house, and beside it a second buggy he didn't recognize. A lawyer. He picked up his stake and his measuring string and his notebook with the waterline readings, and he walked back toward the equipment shed. And he did not look at the main house, and he told himself that was the sensible thing. He told himself that until he was back in the bunkhouse after dark, sitting on his bunk with Bramble's soft noise coming through the wall, and the telling of it had less and less effect the more times he said it. The way a word repeated too many times eventually stops meaning anything at all. He reached under his bunk and pulled out his saddlebags. Not to pack them, just to look at them, just to know they were there. He had slept in bunkhouses from the Panhandle to the Pecos River, and he had always known, in every one of them, exactly what it would take to be gone by morning. He was trying to decide whether that was a comfort or the saddest thing he knew about himself. The saddlebags sat under his bunk for 6 days without being touched. Silas wasn't sure what that meant exactly, whether it was hope or cowardice or just the particular paralysis that sets in when a man can see two roads clearly and knows the cost of both. He got up each morning the same way he always had before the others, in the gray pre-dawn dark, pulling on his boots in silence and heading to the barn to check on Bramble before the workday started. He fed the horse. He ran his hand along the gelding's neck the way he'd done for 15 years, the animal turning its head to look at him with that expression horses get that isn't quite intelligence but is something in the neighborhood of it. "Don't look at me like that," Silas told him. Bramble looked at him like that anyway. The work continued. Warren came that Friday and the Friday after, and both times Silas made sure he was in the far pasture or the equipment shed or somewhere on the property that was not visible from the main house's front porch. He told himself this was the dignified choice. He was not competing. He was not sulking. He was simply a ranch hand doing his work in the sections of the ranch where ranch hands work, which happened to be sections far removed from a wealthy man spreading surveyors, maps, and property documents on Harlan Whitlock's kitchen table. He and Eliza did not speak for those 6 days. She did not ride out to the fence lines. She did not bring coffee. He did not look toward the main house any more than the work required, which was a discipline he maintained with the same mechanical consistency he'd applied to everything else over the past 3 weeks, and which was costing him roughly the same amount of energy as carrying something heavy without being allowed to set it down. On the 7th morning, Harlan Whitlock came to find him. Silas was replacing a rotted section of outbuilding wall real work that genuinely needed doing when he heard the older man's boots on the gravel behind him. Harlan didn't announce himself. He just came and stood nearby in the way that men of a certain generation stand when they have something to say and are deciding how to say it. Silas kept working. You didn't stop what you were doing for Harlan Whitlock unless he told you to stop. That was just how the man operated. That wall's been like that since the spring of '81, Harlan said. I know. I can see where somebody patched it, and the patch gave. Previous hand did that patch. Yes, sir, he used pine. This wall needs oak. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Silas fit another board and checked the level. You've been putting in 7-day weeks, Harlan said. Work needs doing. Work always needs doing. Doesn't mean a man's obligated to do all of it at once. Harlan paused. You're not drawing extra wages for the Sundays. I know that. I'm not going to offer them either. I didn't ask for the Sunday work. No, sir, you didn't. Another pause. Silas fit a nail and drove it, and the sound of the hammer was a clean, practical noise that had nothing complicated about it, which was a relief. My daughter filled those shelves, Harlan said, 2 days after you finished them. She didn't wait. Usually she leaves things for weeks before she gets to them. He let that sit. She put the books in order by subject, spent a whole afternoon on it. Her mother used to do that, organize things carefully when something was on her mind. Silas lowered the hammer. He didn't turn around. He looked at the board he'd just nailed and at the one beside it waiting to be fitted. Mr. Whitlock, he said. His voice came out level, which was a minor accomplishment. I'm not here to tell you what to do, Harlan said. I'm not built that way. Man makes his own choices or they're not worth making. He cleared his throat in the way men clear their throats when they're about to say the actual thing. But I want you to understand something. Warren Blackwell has property. He has standing. He has everything that on paper looks like what a father wants for his child. Yes, sir, I know. And he has never once, Harlan said, slowly and without particular emphasis, as if he were simply reporting the waterline reading on a stake. Ask my daughter a single question about what she wants. Silas turned around then. Harlan was looking at him with the same expression he used when he was assessing livestock, not unkind, not warm exactly, just honest. The expression of a man who has spent 60 years learning to see things as they are rather than as he wishes they were. I'm not a rich man, Silas said. I know what you are and aren't, Harlan said. I've been watching you work my land for 3 years. He tilted his head toward the repaired wall. Oak board, proper level. You checked it twice. He turned to go, then stopped. Man who builds things right when no one's grading him builds other things right too. He walked back toward the main house. Silas stood with the hammer in his hand and something in his chest that felt like the particular sensation of a door being pushed open that you'd spent considerable time pressing shut, and it was not entirely comfortable. Because pressure that's been held for a long time doesn't release clean. He didn't talk to Eliza that day. He thought about Harlan's words through the afternoon and into the evening, and spent most of dinner in the bunkhouse not tasting the salt pork, which was a shame because the cook had actually done something right with it for once. The other hands talked about the usual things, cattle prices, whether the summer was going to be as dry as the spring was suggesting, a horse that one of the hands was thinking about buying from an outfit north of Dry Creek. Silas listened and said almost nothing, which the other men had long ago accepted as simply how Silas was, and thought about what a man who built things right was actually worth in the specific accounting of things that mattered. He thought about the shelves. He thought about Eliza running her fingers along the edge of them. He thought about the lawyer's buggy parked beside Warren's on a Friday afternoon. He kept arriving at the same wall. The following Thursday, 9 days after the creek conversation, Eliza came back to the fence line. She came later than usual, mid-morning rather than early, and she didn't bring coffee. She rode up and stopped and looked at what Silas was doing, which was replacing a corner post, real work, the kind that takes time and isn't comfortable in May heat. That one was on your list from April, she said. Yes. You're getting to the end of the list. Getting close. She dismounted and tied her horse and came to stand a comfortable distance away, not the close distance of the creek, the ordinary distance of someone watching work being done. Warren asked my father for a meeting next Friday, she said. A formal one, he used that word. Formal. Silas kept working the post. He didn't look up. Eliza, I know, she said. I'm not asking you anything. I'm just telling you what's happening because I think you have a right to know, And because I am tired, I am genuinely exhausted of everyone in this situation being given information except you." He set down the digger and straightened up. The sun was behind her, and it made it harder to read her face, which was either accidental or wasn't. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "I don't want you to say anything." Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that wasn't, the way a river is controlled by its banks, but you can still hear the current. "I want you to decide something, that's all. Not for me. For yourself." She looked at him directly. "Because I told you what I told you at the creek, and I meant every word of it. And I am not going to say it again. And after next Friday, things will start moving in directions that are harder to stop." Silas stood in the mid-morning heat with dirt on his hands and a fence post half set, and the most straightforward situation he'd ever found himself in, making him feel more cornered than anything involving an actual physical threat ever had. "I told you at the creek," he said. "I don't have." "I'm not looking for a father," she said. He stopped. "I'm sorry." His voice came out genuinely confused because the sentence had arrived at an angle he wasn't expecting. "You keep explaining to me what you don't have. Land. Money. Position." She said the list without contempt, just cataloging, the way you list things you've already considered. "And you present that list to me as if I'm standing here mistaking you for someone else. As if I might not have noticed, in 4 months of riding out to this fence line, what your situation is." She took one step toward him. "I'm 28 years old, Silas. I'm not confused. I'm not naive. I'm not looking for a father figure to provide for me and arrange my life in a way that makes everyone comfortable." She stopped. "I'm looking for a man who shows up honest and builds things that last and tells me the truth when it costs him something to do it." The meadowlark again, somewhere off in the brush. Same bird or a different one? Silas had no way to know. Eliza said, and his voice was rough in a way it wasn't usually. "If I let myself." He stopped. "Try it again. If I say yes to any part of this and it goes wrong, I haven't only lost a job." "You've lost my choice," she said, "which is mine to make. Your father's goodwill. My father respects you. More than you know. More than he'll probably ever say in so many words, because that's simply not how he is." "Warren is not in this conversation." Silas looked at her. Just looked at her. He'd spent 4 months carefully not doing this, not looking at her the way you look at a person, when you've stopped pretending you don't care what you see. He'd looked at her practically, professionally, at angles that kept the conversation about fence lines and water tables and rotten posts. He looked at her straight now, in the full mid-morning light, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. She meant it. That was the thing. He'd been around enough people who said things they didn't quite mean, whose words and eyes were pointing in slightly different directions, that he'd learned to read the gap between them. There was no gap here. Eliza Whitlock was looking at him with the same direct, unsentimental honesty she brought to every fence post and waterline and conversation that mattered, and she meant precisely what she'd said. And the precision of it was simultaneously the most clarifying and most frightening thing he'd experienced in recent memory. "I need to think," he said. It was inadequate. He knew it was inadequate. "All right," she said, simply, no hurt in it that he could identify. "Just acceptance, the way you accept weather." She untied her horse. "But Silas," she paused with her hand on the saddle, "don't take so long thinking that the decision gets made for you." She rode back toward the house, and Silas drove the fence post the rest of the way into the ground with more force than was strictly necessary, and the ground received it, and the post stood straight. And he stood there looking at it for a while and thought that building something right and being willing to stand in it were sometimes 2 different skills that required different kinds of courage. He'd always had the first one. The second was proving more difficult. What happened next came from a direction Silas hadn't anticipated, which, in retrospect, was predictable, because the things that change a man's mind most completely rarely come from the direction he's been watching. It came from Roy Deakins. Roy was the oldest of the other hands on Red Willow, 54. Missing the top joint of his left index finger from a roping accident in the 70s, with a face that looked like it had been left out in the weather for approximately all of its 54 years. He was not a man given to conversation beyond the operational requirements of ranch work. He said what a job needed said and nothing beyond it. Silas respected him precisely because of this quality which they shared. They were riding the north fence together on a Tuesday, two men and a lot of empty country, which was generally sufficient to keep Roy quiet the entire way out and back. He was quiet for the first 2 hours. He was quiet through the lunch break. Silas ate leaning against a fence post, and Roy ate sitting on the ground with his back against his horse's leg. Then, apropos of nothing audible, Roy said, "You know what I regret?" Silas looked at him. In 3 years working alongside Roy Deakins, he had never heard the man use the word regret. "What?" Silas said. "Clara Hobbs," Roy said, 1972. He said the year as if it were a specific location he could point to on a map. 62 Amarillo, worked at a dry goods store. She had red hair, and she asked me once right out of nowhere. We'd been talking about something else entirely. She asked me if I thought a person could be happy just going from place to place their whole life and never putting anything down permanent. Silas waited. I told her I thought some people were built for permanence and some weren't, Roy said. He bit into his biscuit and chewed it. I believed that. I wasn't lying to her. I genuinely thought it was true. Was it? Roy swallowed. Looked at the horizon. I got to be 54 eating lunch against a fence post, he said. On someone else's land. With the top joint of a finger I lost doing a job I was doing for wages. He was quiet for a moment. Clara Hobbs married a hardware man from Lubbock 2 years later. Had 4 kids. I know because I rode it through Lubbock in '65 and saw her on the street with 2 of them, and she looked like a person who had put something down and watched it grow. He stood up and brushed off his pants. I'm not saying she would have chosen me. I'm saying I never let her make that call. He picked up his horse's reins and started walking. Roy, Silas said. The older man looked back. Why are you telling me this? Roy looked at him with the expression of a man who has said the thing he meant to say and considers the conversation complete. Because you're about to do the same thing I did, he said, and you don't seem like the type who would thank me for it later when it's too late to matter. He mounted up and rode on, and Silas sat against the fence post for another few minutes and stared at the Texas sky, which was very large and very blue and entirely indifferent to the specific crisis of conscience happening beneath it. He thought about Clara Hobbs from Amarillo with red hair and a question Roy Deakins hadn't known how to answer. He thought about Eliza running her fingers along the edge of a shelf to understand how it was made. He thought about a man who was 54 years old, eating lunch alone against someone else's fence, telling a story that was really only useful as a warning. He got up and rode after Roy without saying anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. That night he lay in the bunk and ran through the accounting one more time, the same one he'd done before, the one where he compared what he had against what Warren Blackwell had, and somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted in the way he was running the numbers. He'd been counting his lakhs, land absent, money minimal, position non-existent. He'd been adding those up and measuring them against Warren's column of possessions and arriving at the same answer, deficit. Insufficient, not enough. But Roy Deakins had not said the hardware man from Lubbock was a better man than Roy. Roy had not said Clara Hobbs had made the right choice or the wrong one. Roy had said only that he had never let her make the call. Silas thought about that for a long time. He thought about the specific nature of the choice he was making by not making a choice. He had told himself he was being practical. He had told himself he was sparing Eliza from a limited future. He had told himself he was stepping back out of respect for what she deserved. But Roy's voice in the back of his head said something else. You never let her make that call, because that was what it actually was, wasn't it? Not nobility, not practicality, not respect. He was deciding for Eliza what she should want by removing himself from the inventory of what she could choose from. He was walking the fence line of her future and pulling out the posts he'd decided weren't strong enough before she'd had a chance to test them herself. He sat up in the dark. Bramble shifted in the stall outside. Silas reached under the bunk. The saddlebags were still there. He left them where they were and lay back down. But the decision he'd been avoiding had settled into something solid, the way concrete settles after you pour it, and solid things are harder to argue with than liquid ones. He was going to have to do something. He just didn't know yet whether he was brave enough for the right thing or only brave enough for the wrong one. The answer came 4 days later, and it came in the worst possible way. Warren Blackwell arrived on Friday morning rather than afternoon. He arrived with the same lawyer he'd brought before. A small, neat man named Fetterman, whom Silas had seen twice now and recognized by the way he carried his briefcase pressed against his leg like it contained something he didn't trust the world not to take. They went into the main house, and the door closed, and Silas, who was working the yard gate because the latch he'd repaired in April had developed a new problem, could see the house but could not see anything inside it. He worked the latch. He took it apart, found the problem, and started fixing it, because that was what he was there to do. An hour passed. Then the front door opened and Eliza came out alone. She walked across the yard at a pace that was not quite a walk too controlled, too deliberate, the way someone moves when they are managing something that would come out differently if they let it out naturally. She went to the barn. She did not look at him. 5 minutes later, she came out on her horse. She rode past him without stopping, heading east toward the fence lines. Her face was set and her back was straight, and she did not look like a woman who had just agreed to anything. Silas looked at the gate latch in his hand. He looked at the direction she'd ridden. He set the latch down on the fence post, carefully. The latch that needed fixing would be there when he got back. He went to the barn and saddled Bramble in less time than he usually took, because Bramble was a horse who understood urgency when he felt it in the hands saddling him. And the gelding stood still and cooperative, and did not give Silas the usual argument about the cinch strap. He found her at the eastern fence, the same section where this had all started, the same corner where he'd crouched over a rotten post on a spring morning and given her an honest answer instead of the one she wanted. She wasn't looking at the fence. She was sitting her horse and looking at nothing in particular in the direction of the horizon, and there were no tears on her face, which told him she was either fine or very angry or both. He pulled up beside her and waited. He brought a contract, she said. Her voice was flat, not devastated, angry, not a question. A contract. My father didn't ask for it. Warren apparently decided the time for conversation was over and the time for paperwork was here. She paused. He left the signature line blank, said he was giving me a week. Silas said nothing. My father told him he needed to discuss it with me privately. She turned her horse sideways, which meant she was turning toward him, which meant she was going to look at him directly, and she did. And then Warren said something. She stopped, pressed her lips together once. He said that he understood I was sentimental, and that sentiment was natural in a woman, but that my father was a practical man and would help me see the practical value of the arrangement. The word sentimental sat in the air between them like something that had been thrown. He said that, Silas said, in my father's kitchen, in front of the lawyer. Her voice was very controlled. Sentimental. As if what I have been doing for the past 4 months is feeling things about pretty sunsets and not actually evaluating, every single time I ride out to this fence line, whether what I think is real or whether I've constructed it out of wishful thinking. Silas looked at the fence. The corner post he'd replaced last week was solid. The wire was tight. The thing he'd built was standing. Is it real? He asked. She looked at him sharply. For you, he said. Is it real? I know what it is for me. I know that clearly enough. I'm asking you. Something in her face shifted. The controlled anger didn't go away. It was too legitimate to go away, but something else moved through it, something that had more warmth in it. Yes, she said. Straight. No elaboration, because she was not a person who used elaboration as a substitute for honesty. Silas took a breath. It went in easier than he expected, which surprised him because he'd been breathing around a weight for 4 months and he'd gotten used to the restriction. I need to talk to your father, he said. Eliza was very still. Before next Friday, he said. I need to talk to him directly about what I have and what I don't and what I'm offering, and let him decide what he thinks of it. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at the fence post, that first day, not with hope exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who is checking whether a thing is as sound as it appears. He's not going to give you land, she said. He doesn't have much to give. I'm not asking for land. He's not going to tell you you're a better prospect than Warren Blackwell. By any measurable standard, you're not. I know that too. Then what are you asking him for? Silas thought about it. Thought about Roy Deakins eating lunch against a fence post in a regret that was almost 20 years old. Thought about a man who builds things right. Thought about the difference between deciding for someone and letting them decide. Permission, he said, to let you choose. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass around them, and brambles stood quiet, and in the middle distance a hawk turned slow circles over the south pasture in the patient way of things that are simply waiting for the situation below them to resolve. All right, she said finally. That was all. Just all right, with the weight of something real in it. Silas turned Bramble back toward the main house. He rode at a steady pace, not rushing, because rushing was what a man did when he was afraid, and he had decided, somewhere between the eastern fence and this moment, that fear was a legitimate thing to feel, and an insufficient reason to let it navigate. Harlan Whitlock was on the front steps when he rode in. The lawyer's buggy was gone. Warren's was still there, which meant Warren was still in the house, which meant Silas's timing was, in the way of most important things in life, imperfect. He dismounted and tied Bramble to the post and took his hat off because some things still required that kind of acknowledgement. Harlan watched him come, Mr. Whitlock, Silas said. I'd like a word with you when you have time. He glanced at the house. When your current business is concluded. Harlan looked at him for a long moment with that measuring expression. Then he looked in the direction Silas had come from, where Eliza was presumably still sitting at the eastern fence, and then back at Silas. Warren's getting ready to leave, Harlan said. Come back in an hour. Yes, sir. He took Bramble to the barn and unsaddled him, and brushed him down and gave him water and grain, because a horse that stood for you deserved to be looked after. And because an hour was an hour, and it needed to be spent doing something with his hands, or the thinking would get away from him. He was fitting a loose shoe on one of the other horses when he heard Warren Blackwell's buggy roll out of the yard. He listened to the sound of it getting smaller. He set down the shoe, cleaned his hands on a rag, put his hat back on, and walked back to the main house. Harlan was waiting on the steps with 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. Silas took it. Sit down, Harlan said. Silas sat on the step below him, because that was the shape of things, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. And he held the coffee and looked at the yard, and Harlan looked at the same yard, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Silas said, I'm in love with your daughter. He said it the way he'd said things to Eliza straight, without dress on it, because it was a true thing, and true things deserved to be said plainly. Harlan was quiet. I know what I don't have, Silas continued. I know what Warren has that I don't. I'm not going to pretend there's any version of this accounting where I come out ahead on paper. He turned the cup in his hands. But I'm going to build something. I don't know exactly what yet because I don't have land to build it on and I won't pretend I do. But I'm the kind of man who builds things that last, and I think you know that, and I'm asking you to let Eliza decide whether that's enough for her. Not for you to decide for her, just to let her make the call. Harlan looked at his coffee. He was quiet for long enough that Silas had time to feel the full weight of the silence and decide that whatever came next, he had said what was true and said it without apology, and that would have to be enough. You built those shelves out of post oak, Harlan said. Yes, sir, with mortise joints. Yes, sir. No one asked you to do it that way. No. Harlan nodded slowly, the way he'd nodded at the waterline reading. Just receiving the information. Assessing it. Eliza's mother, he said, and then stopped. He cleared his throat. She had opinions about a lot of things. Strong ones. I disagreed with about a third of them. She was right about 2/3 of the ones I disagreed with, which I found out over time. He drank his coffee. She told me once that the most important thing in a person wasn't what they had. It was what they were willing to build. He looked at Silas sideways. She said that about 37 years ago. I've had some time to figure out she was right about that one, too. Silas held very still. I'm not giving you my blessing, Harlan said. That's Eliza's to give or not, and she'll make that decision without input from me, which is simply her nature, and I stopped arguing with her nature a long time ago. He stood up. But I'm not standing in the way of it either. He took his coffee cup inside. The door didn't close all the way behind him. Silas sat on the step for a moment with his coffee and the open door and the yard that was quiet now without Warren's buggy in it, and he felt something he didn't have a practiced word for, not triumph. Nothing as clean as that. But something more like the sensation of a window being opened in a room where you'd forgotten windows existed. He finished the coffee. He stood up. He had work to do, and none of it was fences. What came in the days that followed was not romance in the way stories make romance. There was no single moment of declaration, no scene assembled for an audience. What there was, instead, was the slightly awkward, frequently uncertain process of two people deciding to be honest with each other in the specific way that has permanent consequences. He talked to Eliza that evening, near the barn, in the plain light of late afternoon, with nothing cinematic about the setting. He told her what he'd told her father in shorter form. He told her he didn't know the exact shape of what he was offering because he didn't yet have the materials to build it, but that he intended to find them. He told her the truth was still the only thing he had in reliable supply, and that he was prepared to offering it for as long as she found it worth having. She listened. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything particularly lyrical. She said, "You know this is going to be complicated." "Yes," he said. "My father is supportive. Warren is going to take this badly." "Probably. People in town are going to have opinions." "People in town always have opinions." She looked at him. "And you're not walking back from this?" He thought of Roy Deakins. He thought of Clara Hobbs from Amarillo. He thought of a fence post you could see, was fine above the ground and rotten below, and the particular danger of only looking at what was visible. "No," he said, "I'm not walking back." She nodded once, the same nod she'd given him about the fence posts on the first day, and reached out and took the coffee cup he was holding empty, had been empty for 20 minutes. He'd just been holding it and turned and went back to the main house. He stood in the yard with his empty hands and felt more grounded in a particular piece of earth than he had in 20 years of walking other men's land. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like the beginning of work, which, for Silas Mercer, was the closest thing to contentment he knew how to recognize. The problem was that contentment and complications were not mutually exclusive, as the following week was about to demonstrate in ways that Silas, for all his experience with difficult ground, had not fully prepared himself for. Warren Blackwell did not withdraw quietly. Warren Blackwell did not come back the following Friday. He came back on Tuesday, which was worse, because Tuesday was a working day, and working days had a rhythm to them that an uninvited visit disrupted in a way that Friday visits, which had become expected, did not. He arrived mid-morning without his lawyer, but with a different kind of purpose in his posture, not the comfortable, property-assessing ease of his previous visits, but something tighter. Something that had been sitting with information over the weekend and had arrived at a response. Silas was in the far north pasture moving cattle to a section of fresher grass when one of the younger hands, a 19-year-old named Pete, who had not yet learned when not to relay information, rode out to tell him that Mr. Blackwell had arrived and was asking to speak with Harlan, and that there seemed to be some kind of discussion happening in the main house. "You saw Eliza?" Silas asked. "She was on the porch when I rode past." "She wasn't inside. That was something at least." He finished moving the cattle because leaving a herd half-moved was how you created a problem that took twice as long to fix. and then he rode back at a measured pace that was slower than he wanted to ride, and faster than pure dignity suggested was appropriate. He tied Bramble at the barn and went back to the work closest to the main house, which was the equipment shed, where there was always something that needed attention and where a man could work with a clear view of the front of the house without appearing to watch it. Warren came out after about 40 minutes. He came out alone, which meant Harlan had not walked him to the door, which meant the conversation had ended at a particular temperature. He stood on the front porch for a moment and looked at the property the way a man looks at something he's reassessing, and then he looked across the yard and found Silas with a kind of inevitability that suggested he'd known where to look. He came across the yard at a walk that was deliberate rather than confrontational. Silas set down what he was doing, because ignoring a man who is walking directly at you is a kind of rudeness that Silas had never been comfortable with regardless of the circumstances. Warren stopped about 6 feet away. He looked at Silas the way he'd looked at him that first morning, the categorizing look, the look that placed a man in his column in a ledger, but there was something different in it now. Not respect, not exactly. More like the adjustment a man makes when a thing he dismissed has turned out to require attention. "I want to understand something," Warren said. His voice was even. He wasn't performing anger or wounded pride. He was, in his way, trying to be rational about something that was not responding to rationality. "And I'm going to ask you directly because I find that cleaner." "All right," Silas said. "Do you have land?" "No." "Savings? Anything substantial?" "No." "A plan for providing for her that doesn't involve working Harlan's land for wages." He'd caught the possessive and corrected it, which was the most honest thing Silas had ever seen him do. "I have the beginning of one," Silas said. Warren looked at him steadily. "The beginning of one," he repeated, and the repetition wasn't mocking, just measuring. "I have 1,200 acres, Mercer. I have a house with 8 rooms. I have connections in this county that can protect her from the kind of bad years that break small operations." He stopped himself, pressed his lips together once. "I can give her a life that doesn't involve uncertainty." "I know that," Silas said. Warren waited, clearly expecting the acknowledgement to lead somewhere. "I know all of that," Silas said again. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter." "It matters." "Then what exactly is your argument?" And now there was something honest in the frustration, something almost human breaking through the property management exterior. "Because I have looked at this from every angle I can find, and I cannot understand what you're offering her that I am not." Silas thought about how to answer that. He thought about the fence posts and the water line and the coffee and the shelves, and he thought about what Eliza had said at the creek about the only man who had consistently offered her the truth, and he thought about how to say any of that to Warren Blackwell without it sounding like a criticism, because a man who is losing something genuinely valuable doesn't deserve to be insulted on top of it. "I think," Silas said carefully, "that Eliza is the one who can answer that." "Not me." Warren looked at him for a long moment. "She's already answered it," he said. "That's why I'm standing here talking to a ranch hand instead of sitting in that house finalizing an agreement with her father." He said it without venom. Just a man identifying the geography of his situation. "I came here today to speak to Harlan because I respect him. And to look at you." He paused. "I wanted to see if I was losing this to someone worth losing it to." Silas didn't say anything. "You built those shelves," Warren said. It wasn't a question. He'd clearly asked someone, probably Harlan, who had built them. "Yes, Harlan says you used post oak with mortise joints." "Yes." Warren was quiet for a moment. He looked at the equipment shed. He looked at the gate with the repaired latch. He looked at the outbuilding wall with the new oak boards. "I don't do things poorly," Warren said finally. "Anything I build well. I want you to know that about me." He looked back at Silas. "I would have taken care of her. Properly. That's not nothing." "No," Silas said. "It's not nothing, and I think you know I know that." Warren held his gaze for another moment. Then he put on his hat, which had been in his hand the whole time, and turned and walked back to his buggy. He didn't look at the house as he left. He climbed up, took the reins, and drove back down the road toward Dry Creek without stopping. And the sound of his buggy wheels on the packed dirt road faded out until there was just the wind in the dry grass and the ordinary sounds of the ranch going about its business. Silas picked up what he'd set down in the equipment shed and went back to work. He worked through lunch and didn't notice until Pete came by and mentioned it was going on 2 in the afternoon, and Silas realized he'd been working on a single piece of harness for about an hour longer than it deserved, which was a sign that his mind had been considerably elsewhere. He was cleaning up the shed at the end of the day when Harlan appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and looked at the organized shed with an expression Silas couldn't immediately read. "Warren's not coming back," Harlan said, "I gathered." "He's a decent man," Harlan said. "I want to be clear on that. He's not a villain in this thing. He had genuine intentions." "I know. But he came in here today to talk me into overriding Eliza's decision, and I told him that there is not a version of events in which that happens, and he took that with more grace than I expected, which I respect." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "He did say something before he left, though." Silas waited. "He said that he hoped you understood what you were taking on. That Eliza was a woman with opinions that would not soften with time." Harlan looked at Silas sideways. "He meant it as a warning. I took it as the most accurate description of my daughter I've ever heard from someone who barely knows her." Silas almost smiled. "Almost, Mr. Whitlock," he said. "I know I don't have land or—" "Silas." Harlan used his first name, which was not something he did often. "I know what you have and don't have. We've covered that territory." He uncrossed his arms. "What I want to know is what you're planning to do about the don'ts." Silas had been thinking about this. He'd been thinking about it with the same methodical attention he gave fence lines starting at one end, working section by section, not skipping to the parts that looked fine. "I've been putting aside what I can from wages," he said. "Not much, but I've been putting it aside. There's undeveloped land east of here, between your boundary and the creek, that I've looked at. About 40 acres. The owner's a man named Cole Pruitt, who inherited it from his father and has no intention of working it. I think it could be bought for a number I could reach with 3 years of saving and a small loan from a land bank in Caldwell." Harlan had gone very still. "I know what 3 years looks like," Silas said. "I'm not asking Eliza to wait 3 years before anything happens. I'm saying that's the direction I'm moving." He looked at Harlan directly. "If she's willing to start from rough and build up, I can build." "I know how. You've seen me build." Harlan looked at him for a long time. "Cole Pruitt's land," he said slowly, "is not prime grazing. The ground's rocky in the north section, I know. I've walked it." "You've walked it," Harlan repeated. "On my own time. I walked it in February before any of this." Silas gestured vaguely, indicating the 4 months of fence lines and coffee and shelves and complications. "Before I had any particular reason to be interested in it, beyond it being good undeveloped land in a range I know." Harlan stared at him. "You were looking at that land in February." "I look at land," Silas said simply. "I always have. I don't own any, but I look at it. I've been looking at land for 20 years without being able to do anything about it." "Habit." Something shifted in Harlan's expression. Not warmth exactly, but the specific look a man gets when a thing he suspected turns out to be confirmed. "Talk to Cole Pruitt," Harlan said, "before you talk to a land bank." Silas waited. "I'll go with you," Harlan said. "Cole will talk differently with me in the room than he will with a ranch hand asking a loan. That's just how Cole is." He pushed off the doorframe. Sunday morning, early, he walked toward the house. Silas stood in the equipment shed with the harness in his hand and the specific feeling of a man who has been carrying something heavy. For so long he's forgotten what his hands feel like without the weight, and who has just, without drama or ceremony, been allowed to set it down on something solid. He put the harness away. He found Eliza that evening near the south barn, checking on a heifer that had been favoring her left foreleg since the previous week. Eliza had her hand on the animal's leg and was pressing gently along the tendon with the focused attention of someone who actually knows what they're doing rather than performing the gesture. Soft tissue, she said, without looking up. She'll need another week off the rocky ground. Agreed, Silas said. She looked up then, read something in his face. Warren came, she said, and went. She looked back at the heifer. Ran her hand along the leg one more time, the same way she'd run her hand along the shelf, understanding through touch what she couldn't see directly. He said something to you. He said he hoped I understood what I was taking on. Silas paused. He meant it critically. I didn't receive it that way. She looked at him. Something in her face relaxed in a way that suggested she'd been holding it tighter than she'd planned to. My father talked to you, she said. Yes, and Sunday morning we're going to talk to Cole Pruitt about his land. Eliza straightened up. She stood beside the heifer, with her hand still resting on the animal's back, and looked at Silas with an expression he was still learning to read, which was part of what made her different from most things in his life. She was not yet fully legible to him, and he found he didn't mind that it was actually something he wanted, rather than something he was managing. 40 acres, she said. It's rough. North section's rocky. I know. I walked it in February. She was very still for a moment. You walked it in February, she said. I walk land. I always have. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, out past the south fence toward the darkening pasture, and something moved across her face that she didn't try to hide and didn't try to display. It was just there, honest and unperformed, and it was the most unguarded he'd ever seen her. All right, she said. The same word as before, the same weight in it. She patted the heifer's flank and walked back toward the main house. And Silas stayed a while with the animal because the heifer needed quiet company and because he needed a moment to let the events of the day settle into the shape they were going to take. The Sunday meeting with Cole Pruitt did not go the way Silas had imagined it, because almost nothing important in life goes the way you imagine it. Cole Pruitt was 68, partially deaf in his right ear, and deeply suspicious of anyone he hadn't known for at least a decade, which put Silas at a categorical disadvantage regardless of Harlan's presence. He received them at his kitchen table with coffee that was genuinely terrible in a manner that suggested he was doing them a courtesy by buying awake. He listened to what Silas said about the land. He listened to Harlan's assessment of Silas's character, which was the most direct and thorough endorsement Harlan had ever offered anyone in Silas's presence, delivered in the flat, factual tone of a man reading an appraisal. Cole Pruitt listened to all of it, drank his terrible coffee, and then said that the land wasn't for sale. Silas absorbed this. Harlan absorbed this. It's not land you're using, Harlan said. I know that, Cole said. Doesn't make it for sale. Your father acquired that parcel to eventually develop it for grazing, Harlan said. You have no cattle. I know what my father bought it for. Cole poured more coffee that no one needed. I might develop it myself. Cole, Harlan said, with the specific patience of a man who has known another man for 30 years and understands exactly what kind of patience is required. You have told me you were going to develop that land in 81, 82, and at some point last fall. You have made no movement in that direction. I've been thinking about it. You've been thinking about it for 8 years. Cole looked at Silas. Directly, the look of a man who has not yet decided what category to put him in. What do you want with it? He asked, not hostile. Genuinely asking. I want to build something on it, Silas said. A house first, then whatever the ground will support for grazing. Work it properly. Make it something instead of leaving it as something that could be something. Cole looked at him for a long moment. His hearing was better than the partial deafness suggested. Silas was realizing he'd caught every word. You got money? Cole asked. I have the beginning of money. I can get more, not fast, but reliably, Cole repeated. He said it the way you test a word you've heard before in a different context. Harlan vouches for reliably? I wouldn't be here if I didn't, Harlan said. Cole drank his terrible coffee. I'll lease it, he said finally. Not sell, lease. 2 years. You work that ground, improve it. Show me something real, then we talk about selling. He looked at Silas. You put a house on it. That house is yours regardless. I'm not so cold as to take a man's house. Silas thought about 2 years. He thought about the difference between the lease he could afford now and the purchase he couldn't, and the 2 years of time in between in which a lot of things could go wrong and a few things might go right. "What's your number for the lease?" he asked. Cole named a figure. It was not low. Silas looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the wall above Cole's head for a moment, the way men look at things when they're doing arithmetic and don't want you to watch them do it. Then he looked at Cole. "That's strong for undeveloped rocky ground," Harlan said. "That's what it is," Cole said. "I'll lend the lease payment," Harlan said. "First year, against future labor credit." Silas turned to look at him. "Don't," Harlan said without looking at Silas. "I'm not doing it for sentiment. I'm doing it because that land adjacent to my eastern fence improves in value when it's worked by someone who knows what they're doing, and I have a practical interest in it not sitting fallow for another decade." He looked at Cole. "And because I know you, Cole, and I know you'd rather see it improved than hold it for the principle of a thing." Cole considered this for a long moment. He poured a third cup of coffee that Silas genuinely believed might be dangerous to consume. "First year," Cole said, "Harlan's terms. Second year, you pay direct. End of second year, I decide on sale based on what I see." He put out his hand. Silas shook it. He rode back to Red Willow beside Harlan in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but that contained a considerable amount of material that neither of them was inclined to process out loud. The country around them was flat and dry and very large, the kind of landscape that reduces a man's complications to their actual size, and the actual size of Silas's complications, at this particular moment, was manageable. Not easy, not resolved manageable. "You understand," Harlan said, about halfway back, "that the money I'm putting up against labor credit is not charity. You'll work it off." "I understand that completely," Silas said. "And you understand that 40 acres with rocky north ground and an unbuilt house on it is not." "Is not a finished life," Silas said. "I know, I'm not offering Eliza a finished life." "What are you offering her then?" Silas thought about it. He thought about what he'd said to her at the creek and at the barn, and what she'd said back, and the particular honest exchange they'd been having since April about what things actually were versus what people assumed they should be. "The foundation," he said, "and the work." Harlan was quiet for the rest of the ride. What happened next moved both faster and slower than Silas had anticipated, which was in keeping with his general experience that the things worth doing are never timed the way you'd plan them if you were in charge of the timing. He told Eliza about Cole Pruitt's land that evening. He told her plainly a lease, not a purchase, 2 years, rocky north section, no house yet, Harlan's loan against labor credit, and the genuine possibility that Cole Pruitt would change his mind at the end of 2 years for reasons that were entirely within Cole's rights to act on. She listened to all of it. "Rocky North section," she said. "What's your plan for that?" He hadn't expected that to be her first question. "Clear it, mostly. Stone's a building material if you cut it right. There's enough in that north section to build a foundation and a root cellar without buying material." She looked at him. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about that land since February," he said. "I told you I walk land. I look at what it could be." Something settled in her face. Not surprise, because she'd had enough of his honesty by now to stop being surprised when it showed up. But something warmer, something that was becoming, over these months, the way she looked at him specifically. "When are you starting?" she asked. "The lease starts in 2 weeks. I'll begin clearing the north section on Sundays. Harlan said I can use the workhorse for the heavy pulling." "I'll help," she said. He started to say something reflexive about the work being heavy. She looked at him with an expression that made him close his mouth. "I'll help," she said again. "Just twice. That was sufficient." He nodded. She nodded. And that was essentially how Silas Mercer and Eliza Whitlock became something that Dry Creek, Texas, did not initially know how to categorize not engaged. Not formally courting in any way that the town's social architecture had established precedent for, but unmistakably moving in the direction of something permanent. Dry Creek had opinions. Dry Creek expressed its opinions the way small frontier towns always have, not directly, not confrontationally, but through the specific atmospheric pressure of collective observation. The women who came to the general store on Saturday mornings had conversations that paused when Eliza walked in and resumed at a slightly different register when she walked out. The men who drank at the single saloon on Morrow Street discussed Harlan Whitlock's apparent loss of business sense. A woman named Margaret Tate, who had known Harlan since before Eliza was born and considered this relationship sufficient authority on all matters related to the Whitlock family, told 3 separate people on 3 separate occasions that she had always thought Eliza was too headstrong for her own good, and that this was simply the natural consequence of letting a girl go east for an education. Silas heard some of this through Pete, who was 19 and had not yet learned to edit what he relayed. He heard more of it through Roy Deakins, who mentioned it once with the specific economy of a man who says a thing once and does not repeat it. "They're talking," Roy said, over a lunch that was again eaten against a fence post. "I imagine. Saying Harlan's lost his judgment. Harlan's judgment is fine." "I know that," Roy said. "I'm telling you what they're saying." He looked at Silas. "Doesn't bother you?" Silas thought about it honestly. "Some," he said, "but not the way it would have 2 months ago." Roy looked at the horizon. "Funny how that works," he said, with the tone of a man who has discovered this at great personal expense and is somewhat relieved to see the information being used. Eliza, for her part, received Dry Creek's atmospheric disapproval the way she received most things, with the kind of direct, unruffled awareness that came from a woman who had already decided what she thought and was not in the market for alternative input. She went to the general store on Saturdays the same as always. She greeted Margaret Tate the same as always. She did not perform indifference to what people thought. She simply appeared to have no vacancy in which their opinions could take up residence. Silas found this admirable in a way he didn't have good words for. The first Sunday they worked Cole Pruitt's land together, they spent 6 hours clearing stone from the north section. It was hard. Unromantic work. The stone came out of that ground in reluctant chunks, some of them large enough to require both of them and a pry bar, and the red Texas dirt clung to everything, and the sun was already hot enough by 9 in the morning to make a person regret whatever they were wearing. Eliza worked without complaint and without performing the absence of complaint, which was the important distinction. She lifted what she could lift and called for help with what she couldn't, and made decisions about where to stack the cleared stone with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. At midday, they sat in what shade the single live oak on the property provided, and ate the lunch she'd packed: cold biscuits and dried beef and water from his canteen, and looked at what they'd cleared and what remained, and thought about the size of the project they were beginning. "The foundation for the house," she said. "Where?" He showed her. He'd been carrying the location in his head since February, the way you carry things you keep returning to. The slight rise near the center of the property, where the ground was solid, where a west-facing porch would catch the late afternoon shade, where the drainage would run away from the structure rather than toward it. She looked at it, looked at the land around it, looked at where the creek would be to the east. "You've been building this house for a while," she said. Quietly, not an accusation. "In my head," he said. "I didn't have it, was just thinking. I think about land." She looked at him. "Silas," she said, "you were building a house on land you didn't own for a life, or you hadn't decided you were allowed to want." He didn't answer that immediately. "That's one way to put it," he said. She looked at the rise where the foundation would go, at the live oak that would eventually shade the east side of a porch that didn't exist yet, at the rocky ground that would take months to make into anything, and she said, more to herself than to him, "I would have been so angry if you'd ridden away." He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was still looking at the land. Her jaw was set the way it got when she was being honest about something that cost her. "Eliza," he said, "I'm not asking you to say anything," she said. "I'm just telling you so you know." He let it sit for a moment. Then he said, "I know." She nodded, still not looking at him. "Do you know," he said, "that I was actually going to?" ride away. Now she looked at him. I had the saddlebags out, he said. Under the bunk. 6 days they sat there. I kept telling myself it was the reasonable thing. He looked at his hands dirty from the stone clearing, the kind of dirty that takes more than one washing. Roy Deakins talked me out of it, or into the alternative. Whatever you want to call it. She stared at him. Roy Deakins. He told me about a woman named Clara Hobbs in Amarillo. Eliza blinked. Roy Deakins told you about a woman. He told me he spent 30 years regretting not letting her make the choice. He looked at her. So, when you said to me that you weren't looking for a father, that was the moment I stopped running the accounting the same old way. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that unguarded expression he was slowly learning to read. I didn't say that to you directly, she said. I said it to Warren. That morning he made the comment about your age. I know. I was 30 feet away, fixing a gate latch. He paused. I heard it. Something crossed her face that was closest to what most people would call relief, though on Eliza it came out quieter than that, just the slight release of something held. Good, she said finally. I meant it to Carrie. He looked at her. She looked at the land. Then she stood up, picked up the pry bar, and went back to work. And Silas sat for one more moment in the shade of the live oak and looked at 40 acres of rough, rocky, undeveloped ground and felt the specific, complicated weight of something that was not yet what it was going to be. That was only the raw materials of what it was going to be, and found it the most promising thing he'd looked at in his life. He picked up his gloves and went back to work too. The weeks that followed carried their own momentum. Silas worked the land on Sundays and some evenings after the ranch work was done. Eliza came most Sundays and some evenings as well, and they worked alongside each other with the easy practical rhythm of two people who are not trying to perform a partnership, but simply finding themselves in one. They argued twice once about the placement of the root cellar, which Silas won on drainage grounds, and once about the width of the foundation for the house, which Eliza won because her instinct about the room proportions turned out to be more sophisticated than what Silas had originally planned. He didn't mind losing that one. He noticed that he didn't mind, which was itself information. The question of marriage came up in the least ceremonial way possible. On a Thursday evening in late August, when they were both tired and dirty from clearing a section of cedar brush from the southeast corner and sitting on the tailgate of a borrowed wagon eating cold apples from the main house kitchen. My father asked me yesterday, Eliza said, when we were planning to do something formal. Silas looked at his apple. What did you tell him? I told him when we got around to it. She took a bite. He didn't find that satisfying, I imagine not. He's not opposed, she said. He just appears to have developed a preference for things being formal. Which is interesting, since he spent 60 years being the least formal person in this county. He has reasons, Silas said. I know his reasons, she said. I'm his daughter. Silas looked at her. In the fading August light, she had cedar dust in her hair and a scrape on her right hand that she hadn't mentioned getting and probably wouldn't mention getting. And she was eating a cold apple with the calm concentration of someone who'd done a full day's work and was eating because she needed to, rather than because it was a performative moment of rest. And she looked exactly like a person he wanted to keep looking at for the rest of his life. Eliza, he said. Yes, she said. I'm asking, he said. She stopped chewing. He looked at her steadily. I don't have a ring. I don't have a speech. I've got 40 rocky acres and a lease and the foundation stones stacked in the north section, and whatever this is worth. He held up the apple, which was somewhat battered. Then he set it down because it was not actually helping his point. I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said, the same word she'd used when he asked if it was real for her. Just the one word with everything in it. He let out a breath he'd been holding for approximately 4 months. She took another bite of her apple. We should tell my father before he asks me again, she said. He'll ask again by Saturday, Silas said. Saturday, she agreed. The Dry Creek social architecture, which had been running at full disapproval capacity since May, received the news of Silas Mercer and Eliza Whitlock's engagement with a kind of layered response that only small communities can generate surprise. Recalibration. Quiet arithmetic of who was right about what. And eventually, for most people, the particular acceptance that comes when a thing is already done, and the couple question appears to be neither fragile nor interested in anyone's revision of their opinion. Margaret Tate said she had always thought Eliza had good instincts about character, which was so thoroughly the opposite of what she'd said in May that 2 of the 3 people who'd heard her in May brought it up to her directly. She did not acknowledge the contradiction, which was its own kind of character. Warren Blackwell, when the news reached him, and in Dry Creek, it reached everyone within a week, sent a bottle of good whiskey to Harlan, with a note that said only, "Whitlock well chosen." He addressed it to Harlan rather than to the couple, which was either genuine grace or a last flicker of wounded pride, or possibly both, and Harlan kept the whiskey and did not comment on which interpretation he favored. Silas heard about the whiskey from Harlan, who mentioned it in the same informational tone he used for waterline readings and fence post assessments. "That's a decent thing," Silas said. "Warren's a decent man," Harlan said. "I told you that before you did." Harlan looked at him. "You believed me?" "Not at the time," Silas said honestly. "Mostly now." Harlan nodded, turned, and went back into the house. This was, Silas had come to understand, Harlan's version of a long conversation. The wedding was in October, late enough that the worst of the heat had passed, and early enough that the northern cold hadn't settled in. There was no church involved and no substantial ceremony. Harlan brought in a justice of the peace from the county seat, and they stood on the front porch of the Red Willow main house with Harlan and Roy Deakins and Pete and the other 2 hands, and a neighbor woman named Adela Fuentes, who had been Eliza's mother's closest friend and who cried, steadily and unselfconsciously throughout the proceedings. Eliza wore the same dress she wore to the Dry Creek Founders' Day dinner, because it was her best dress, and there was no reason to acquire a different one, and she had pinned her hair up in the way she wore it when she was dressed for somewhere rather than for work. Silas wore clean clothes and his good boots, which he had polished, and looked at Eliza during the reading of the vows with the expression of a man who has not yet entirely processed the distance between where he started this year and where he is standing now. Roy Deakins did not cry, but he looked, at one point during the ceremony, like a man who was thinking about a woman named Clara Hobbs from Amarillo, and was feeling something that was both sad and quietly resolved in the way that regrets feel when you've watched someone else not repeat them. After they ate at the Red Willow table Adela had cooked, which was a significant improvement over the bunkhouse fare, Silas was accustomed to, and Roy said 4 words, which was essentially a speech by his standards. "You did right, Mercer." Silas nodded and ate his food and sat beside his wife, which was a phrase he turned over in his mind several times during dinner because it had not yet settled into the ordinary thing it would eventually become. His wife, Eliza Whitlock, who was now Eliza Mercer, who had said yes with 1 word and meant all the words in it, who had run her fingers along the edge of a shelf to understand how it was made, who was not looking for a father, but for someone who showed up honest and built things that lasted. They rode out to Cole Pruitt's 40 acres that evening, just the 2 of them, as the sun went down. The foundation stones were stacked in the north section. The root cellar was dug and lined. The live oak cast a long shadow across the rise where the house would stand. They sat on the stones and looked at what was there and what wasn't yet. "It's a long way from finished," Silas said. "Yes," Eliza said. "Winter's going to be hard." "I know. The north section still needs." "Silas," she said. He stopped. She was looking at the land with the expression he'd finally learned to read, the quiet one that had nothing performance in it. "I know what it still needs," she said. "I've been here every Sunday." "I know the list as well as you do." She looked at him. "I'm not afraid of the list." He looked at her. "I know," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, not dramatically, just with the easy weight of someone who has decided where they want to be. The October light was going gold over 40 acres of rough, unfinished, promising Texas ground, and somewhere in the south pasture of Red Willow, Bramble was in a good stall with clean water and grain. And inside the main house, Roy Deakins was probably saying nothing to Harlan Whitlock, and the foundation stones were solid beneath them. And the house that existed right now only in Silas Mercer's head was going to take a long winter of hard work to become real. He was looking forward to it in a way he didn't know how to explain and didn't try. He put his arm around her. She stayed where she was. The land sat in the evening light and waited for what they were going to make of it. The first winter was the hardest thing Silas Mercer had ever done, and he had done a considerable number of hard things. It started in November with 3 weeks of cold rain that turned Cole Pruitt's 40 acres into a landscape that was equal parts mud and discouragement. The foundation stones Silas had spent the fall stacking and fitting with such careful attention became half submerged in standing water. And the drainage plan he'd been confident about in October proved to have one flaw, a low point on the southwest corner that he hadn't identified because the ground had been dry when he'd mapped it. Water found that low point with the complete indifference that water has for human planning, and it pooled there. And Silas stood in the rain looking at it with the specific expression of a man who has made a mistake he should not have made and knows it. He told Eliza that evening. She was in the small room they were renting from Adela Fuentes in Dry Creek, while the house was being built 2 rooms above the woman's kitchen, low-ceilinged and drafty, with a window that let in more weather than it should have, and a floorboard near the door that spoke every time you stepped on it. It was not comfortable. Neither of them had complained about it, but neither of them had called it anything other than temporary either. "How bad is the pooling?" Eliza asked. "Bad enough that I need to redirect the drainage before I can set the wall framing. Another 2 weeks of work before I can do what I'd planned to do this week." She looked at him. "Can you fix it?" "Yes, then fix it," she said. Simply, without any of the sighing or recalculating that he'd half expected, not because he thought poorly of her, but because the circumstances genuinely invited sighing and recalculating. "It's going to push the roof timeline," he said, "if we don't have a roof before hard freeze." "Silas." She set down the mending she'd been doing, something of his that needed attention at the elbow, and looked at him fully. "You found the problem. You know how to fix it. Stop presenting me with the consequences of fixing it as if you're looking for permission to be upset about them." He looked at her. "Fix the drainage," she said, "then do the next thing." He went back the following morning in continuing rain and redirected the drainage, which took longer than 2 weeks because the ground was uncooperative, and because fixing something that water has decided to disagree with requires a particular combination of patience and stubbornness that even Silas, who had both in supply, found wearing. He fixed it on a Thursday in late November, standing in mud to his boot tops, and he knew it was right when the water moved the way. Water moves when you've built the ground correctly, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just with the quiet compliance of a thing that now has somewhere to go. He came home that evening so dirty that Adela Fuentes took one look at him in her doorway and pointed to the yard with an expression that required no translation. He cleaned up outside in the cold and ate dinner and told Eliza the drainage was done. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand once. Then she let go and went back to eating. That was all. It was enough. 2 neighboring ranchers came in December, men named Gideon Cross and Tom Alderman, both of whom ran operations within 6 miles of the Pruitt land and had known Harlan Whitlock for over a decade. They showed up on a Saturday morning with a wagon of lumber and no particular announcement. Gideon Cross was a large, quiet man who communicated primarily in action rather than speech. He looked at the foundation, walked the perimeter, identified the corrected drainage with a nod that indicated he knew what he was looking at, and picked up a hammer without being asked. Tom Alderman was somewhat more verbal. "Harlan told us you were out here making something," he said, looking around at the cleared north section, the stacked stone, the foundation work. "Didn't say it was this far along." "It's not as far along as it looks," Silas said. "It's further along than it looks from the road," Tom said. "Which is what counts. They worked that Saturday and came back the following Saturday and the one after that. They did not accept wages. Tom accepted meals, which Eliza prepared and brought out to the site with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, and Gideon accepted meals in the use of Silas's good draw knife, which he returned in better condition than he'd borrowed it, which Silas noted and appreciated. Neither man said anything directly about the fact that they were helping a ranch hand who'd married above his acknowledged station, build a house on leased land adjacent to a property owned by a man who'd been willing to lend the lease payment against future labor. Small frontier communities understood the geometry of mutual aid without requiring it to be narrated, and Gideon Cross and Tom Alderman were not men who required narration. The walls went up in December, not fast, not without problems. Silas had to pull 3 boards that were subtly warped in ways that would have caused structural issues later, and the window framing on the east side had to be redone when the first attempt showed a gap at the upper left corner that no amount of persuasion was going to close correctly. He pulled it out and did it again. He showed no frustration about this in front of Gideon and Tom because it was not their mistake to absorb, and he showed approximately half his actual frustration in front of Eliza because she had enough practical sense to recognize when a man needed to express something without being managed. And she let him say what he said about the window framing without offering solutions he hadn't asked for, and then she handed him the coffee she'd brought and said, "You'll get it right the second time." He did. The roof went on in January, which was technically a month later than Silas's original plan, and considerably more miserable in terms of working conditions than October would have been. He and Gideon Cross finished the last section on a Tuesday afternoon with the kind of cold that sits in your hands and tells you exactly what age you are. And when Silas drove the last nail and looked down from the roof at the structure below him, 4 walls, solid level, with a roof that was going to shed water, the way roofs are supposed to, he felt something that moved through his chest without much warning. He didn't say anything about it. He climbed down and put away his tools and thanked Gideon, who nodded and said he'd be back for the interior work on Saturday, and Silas rode back to the 2 rooms above Adela's kitchen and told Eliza the roof was on. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I want to see it." They rode out in the January cold, just the 2 of them, in the last hour of afternoon light. She stood in the unfinished interior dirt floor, no plaster on the walls yet, light coming in through the spaces where the windows would go, and turned slowly, looking at the dimensions of the rooms, the way the spaces related to each other. The header Silas had set above the doorway between the main room and the kitchen area. "This is bigger than I thought," she said. "It's the same size I told you." "I know, but numbers and rooms are different things." She stood in the middle of the main room and looked up at the roof. No leaks. The rain that had come the previous week had tested it without finding a way in. "You built a house," she said. "We built it," he said. "You meet Gideon, Tom. You built the bones of it," she said. "That's different from helping." She said it without particular sentiment, just making a distinction that mattered to her. He looked at the room. He'd been looking at this room for almost a year in his head. Since the February morning he'd first walked the land and found the rise and started, without permission from himself, imagining what could stand on it. The room in his head and the room he was standing in were not identical. The room in his head had been hypothetical, clean-edged, uncomplicated by drainage problems and warped boards and frozen hands, and a window frame he'd built twice. This room had all of that in it. You couldn't see it, but it was there, in the way the materials had been worked and reworked until they were right, and he thought that was actually better. A room that's been fought for has something in it that a hypothetical room doesn't. "Eliza," he said. She turned. "Thank you," he said. Just that. He meant it to carry everything: the Sundays clearing stone, the cold apple lunches, the evenings she'd listened to him, work through problems he should have solved faster, the way she had said fix it and do the next thing without drama or complaint, the way she had chosen this when she did not have to choose it. She looked at him in the cold interior of the unfinished house and said, "You would have built something anyway, eventually. With or without me, maybe," he said, "but not this." No, she said, not this. They moved in March, before the interior was fully finished, because Adela Fuentes' 2 rooms had served their purpose, and continuing to occupy them was beginning to feel like staying somewhere past the time you'd been invited. The floors were done. The walls were plastered in the main room and the bedroom and the kitchen. The other 2 rooms, because Silas had built for what the future might need, rather than only for what the present required, were framed but not finished, and would remain that way for a while, which neither of them found troubling. The post oak shelves went in on the first Saturday after they moved in. Silas had been saving the wood for them since fall good straight post oak from a tree that had come down on the north section during a storm in October, which he'd cut and dried carefully because he'd known what he was going to do with it. He built them in the main room against the east wall with the same mortise joints he'd used at Red Willow. He took his time. He checked them twice, and then a third time, not because he thought he'd made an error, but because the particular truth he'd learned the hard way was that things worth making were worth making carefully, even when no one was grading you. Eliza watched him fit the last shelf without saying anything until he stepped back, and they both looked at the finished piece. Same joint, she said. Yes, you always use those. They're the right way to do it. She came and ran her fingers along the edge of the lowest shelf, the same way she'd done at Red Willow the first time, learning through touch how something was made. Then she turned and went to the 2 crates of books that had been sitting in the corner since they'd moved in, and she began unpacking them. He sat at the kitchen table and watched her organize the books. She did it with the same focused attention she gave to everything, reading the spines, making decisions, occasionally rearranging a section when she changed her mind about the order. She filled the first 3 shelves. She left the top shelf empty. That one, Silas said. She looked at it. Not yet, she said. I'll know when I find the right thing for it. He thought about that. About a shelf held empty for something not yet found. About the specific act of leaving space for what you don't know yet, instead of filling it with what you have, because the empty space makes you uncomfortable. He thought that was the most Eliza thing she'd ever done, and that he meant that entirely as a description of why he loved her. The first full spring on their own land was the spring of 1884, and it was merciless in the way that Texas springs can be 2 late frosts that killed what Eliza had started in the kitchen garden. A stretch of wind in April that blew 3 sections of their fence down and required 4 days of repair work during planting season. And a moment in May when a creek fluctuation threatened to undercut the eastern boundary of the property in a way that, if it had continued, would have cost them both time and money they didn't have cushion for. Silas handled each of these things the same way he'd handled the drainage problem in November. He identified what was wrong, figured out how to fix it, and fixed it. And when it took longer than he'd planned or cost more than he'd budgeted, he told Eliza exactly what the situation was, and they worked out the response together. They argued about the creek boundary. Silas wanted to address it with a particular method that Eliza thought was expensive and short-sighted. And Eliza wanted to address it with a method that Silas thought was cheaper in the short term and problematic in the long term. And they went back and forth about it on 2 separate evenings before Eliza looked at the ground herself and conceded that Silas was right about the long-term problem. And Silas conceded that her solution for the short-term stopgap while he built the permanent fix was better than what he'd been planning. This was the way things worked between them. It was not smooth. It did not resemble the marriages that Dry Creek expected or understood, where the divisions of authority were clearer and required less negotiation. Eliza Mercer had opinions about the ranch, about the cattle, about the planting, about the water and the fencing and the long-term direction of the property, and she expressed them directly and expected them to be heard, and Silas heard them, and sometimes acted on them, and sometimes didn't, and they disagreed about which times were, which with enough frequency that anyone watching from the outside would not have mistaken their marriage for a peaceful one. But peaceful and good are different categories, and Silas had learned. Slowly, and with the particular education that comes from actually living alongside another person, rather than imagining what it would be like, that the two things were not the same. He'd spent 20 years around peaceful arrangements that were fundamentally empty. What he had with Eliza was not empty on any day, including the difficult ones. Tom Alderman said something about this once, unsolicited, while the two of them were working a section of boundary fence on a June afternoon. He said, "You and Eliza fight a fair bit. We disagree about things," Silas said. "Same thing." "Not quite." Tom considered this for a moment. "My wife and I don't fight much," he said. "I'm not sure if that's good or bad. I think it might be that we just don't talk about enough things that matter." Silas drove a staple into the post. "Eliza talks about things that matter," he said. "I noticed," Tom said, and the tone was not critical, just observational, the tone of a man taking honest inventory. Cole Pruitt came by in July unannounced, which was his way. He came alone, without ceremony, and he walked the property with Silas for about an hour, looking at what had been done and what remained and how the land was responding to being worked. He looked at the north section, which was no longer rocky waste but was being converted, slow section by section, into usable grazing ground. He looked at the house and walked through the interior without commenting. He stood for a while on the west-facing porch that Silas had built in April, looking out over the pasture and the distant line of the creek. "The drainage on the south corner," Cole said, "fixed it in November. It had a low point I'd missed." "I know about that low point," Cole said. "My father identified it in '74. He meant to address it." Silas looked at him. "He never got to it," Cole said. "Flat. Just a thing that was true." They stood on the porch for another moment. "You're a year into a 2-year lease," Cole said. "Yes." "Said at the end of 2 years we'd talk about sale." "Yes, I'm moving that conversation up," Cole said. He named a number. It was the same number he'd have gotten from a buyer with money and no history with the land, which was either fair or harsh, depending on how you looked at it. It was also a number Silas could not reach without help, which Cole apparently understood. "I'll take payment over 5 years," Cole said, "at the going rate on a land bank note." Silas looked at him. "Why?" Cole turned and looked at him with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being asked to explain himself and is finding it tolerable in this specific instance. "Because my father bought that land to see it worked," he said. "And he didn't live to see it. And you're working it right." He cleared his throat. "And because Harlan Whitlock has been my neighbor for 30 years, and he'd be disappointed in me if I handled this poorly, and I prefer not to disappoint Harlan." He put out his hand. Silas shook it. He told Eliza that evening. She was in the garden, or what was becoming a garden, the killed-back spring planting, replaced by a hardier summer effort, and she straightened up when he came, and he told her straight the number and the terms and the 5-year payment. She calculated something in her head. He watched her do it. She did math quickly, and in her head, which was a skill he respected, and which occasionally alarmed him when it revealed numbers he'd been hoping to approach more gradually. "We can do that," she said. "It's tight, but we can do it." "Tight," he agreed. "I'll take the extra chickens to market in August. And I've been thinking about the south pasture if we expand the herd by 10 head in spring, the income." "Eliza," he said. She stopped. "We own it," he said. "Or we will. In 5 years we'll own it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the garden, at the house, at the west-facing porch, at the south pasture where their small, imperfect herd was grazing in the July heat. 40 acres, she said. 40 acres. She pressed her lips together once, quickly, in the way she did, when something was hitting her that she hadn't expected to hit quite that way. Then she nodded, the familiar single nod, and said, "We should tell my father. He'll want to know." They told Harlan that Sunday. He received the news in the way he received most good news without excess, with the particular stillness of a man who feels something, but sees no reason to make it larger than it is. He shook Silas's hand. He looked at Eliza. Something moved across his face that was there and gone too quickly to be called by name. But Silas had by now spent enough time reading the small expressiveness of Harlan Whitlock's face to know that what had just crossed it was the specific satisfaction of a man who has watched a thing he wasn't certain about become a thing he's certain of. "Your mother would have liked this," Harlan said to Eliza. Quietly, more quietly than his usual register, Eliza looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. That was all. Some things didn't need more than that. Roy Deakins heard about the land purchase from Pete, who still had not learned when not to relay information, and came to find Silas on a Monday morning on the Red Willow fence line, where Silas still worked his regular days. Because owning 40 acres on a 5-year payment plan did not alter the reality of monthly wages, which were still very much required. Roy came up beside him and worked in silence for about 20 minutes, which was normal, and then said, "Heard about Cole Pruitt's land." "Yes," Silas said. "Good," Roy said. He went back to working. Silas worked beside him and thought about Roy Deakins eating lunch against a fence post in his 50s. Telling a story about a woman from Amarillo, not because he wanted sympathy, but because he was watching a man about to make the same error and had decided that speaking once was worth doing, even if it felt uncharacteristic. He thought about what a small act of honesty from an unlikely person at the right moment could alter the entire trajectory of a life, and he thought he ought to say something about that. "Roy," he said. Roy looked at him. "That thing you told me," Silas said. "About Clara Hobbs." Roy looked back at the fence. "I know," Roy said, which was not what Silas had expected him to say. "You know what? I know it mattered." A pause. Why else would I have said it? He drove a staple into the post with 3 clean strikes and moved to the next section, and Silas looked at his back for a moment and thought that Roy Deakins was considerably more deliberate than he appeared, which was a quality Silas understood and appreciated, and let the matter rest where Roy had put it. The second year was different from the first in the way that second years always are not easier exactly, but more legible. The problems that arrived were problems they'd seen variations of before and could approach with something closer to experience rather than improvisation. The south pasture fence held through winter. The drainage on the southwest corner performed correctly through 2 heavy rains that would have exposed it if it hadn't been right. The kitchen garden survived the spring frosts because Eliza had covered it based on what she'd learned from losing it the previous year, which was a small thing that Silas nonetheless noticed with the particular attention he gave to evidence of someone who learns from what happens instead of from what they wish had happened. Their first child came in the spring of 1885, which arrived at a point in the construction of their life together that was still unfinished enough to make the timing genuinely inconvenient and significant enough to make the inconvenience feel entirely beside the point. He was born in the main room of the house Silas had built, with Adela Fuentes in attendance, because she had delivered approximately a third of the children in the surrounding county and approached the work with the calm competence of someone who has done a thing enough times to understand it deeply. Harlan arrived the following morning and stood in the room looking at his grandson with the expression of a man receiving information that reorganizes something fundamental. They named him John Harlan Mercer, which was not a decision Silas had lobbied, for Eliza had proposed it, and he'd agreed because it was the right thing, and he knew it was the right thing and didn't require convincing. Harlan held the child for about 3 minutes, said nothing, handed him back with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not trust his hands with something this significant, and went outside. Silas found him on the west-facing porch about 10 minutes later, looking at the pasture. "He's a good size," Harlan said. "Yes," Silas said. "Eliza's all right. She's doing well." Harlan was quiet. "My wife," Harlan said, "died in this county before she had the chance to be a grandmother." He said it without particular emotion, just placing the fact where it belonged. That's the thing about time. You can't negotiate the timing of what you lose. Silas stood beside him and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. "But sometimes," Harlan said, more quietly, "you get to be here for the thing that comes after." He went back inside to sit in the kitchen, which was his way of being present without being demonstrative, and Silas stayed on the porch for a while in the spring morning and looked at what had grown from the rough ground under his feet, and felt, in the bones of his 40-year-old body, the specific and unreasonable gratitude of a man who had nearly ridden away. The children came the way things that are built well tend to, one at a time, with appropriate difficulty and no shortcuts. John was followed by a daughter, Clara, 2 years later, and then by a second son, Thomas, 3 years after that. The names were not accidental Clara, for the woman Roy hadn't had the courage to let make her choice, though Silas never told Roy this directly, and Thomas for Tom Alderman, who'd shown up with lumber on a December morning, when showing up with lumber was the most important thing a neighbor could do. Tom Alderman cried when he heard his name in the child's, which surprised everyone, including Tom. The children grew up on 40 acres that were no longer leased, because the fifth-year payment to Cole Pruitt was made in the fall of 1889 with a cashier's note from the land bank in Caldwell, and Cole received it with the brief, satisfied nod of a man who has watched a long-term assessment prove correct. He shook Silas's hand again, the same hand he'd shaken in his kitchen over terrible coffee, and said, "My father would have been glad to know it." Silas thought about a man who had intended to improve a piece of ground and hadn't lived to do it. He thought about intentions that need someone else's hands to be realized. He thought about the strange, nonlinear way that things get built across time, across people, across the gap between what one person meant to do and what another person actually does. "Thank you for the lease," Silas said. "The terms were fair." Cole looked at him. "The terms were accurate," Cole said. Which was, Silas understood, Cole Pruitt's version of a different statement entirely. The children inherited, in different proportions and different forms, the things their parents had in surplus. John had Eliza's instinct for evaluation. He looked at things directly and formed opinions that were difficult to move without good reason, which made him occasionally frustrating to argue with and generally reliable in a crisis. Clara had Silas's patience, the kind that looks like stillness, but is actually a form of sustained attention, and she had her mother's honesty, which was a combination that made her simultaneously the most trustworthy person on the property and the person least likely to tell you what you wanted to hear. Thomas was the most like neither of them, and therefore most interesting. He had an appetite for risk that neither Silas nor Eliza could account for in their own histories, and a talent for getting other people to help him that Silas recognized, after some reflection, as a skill he didn't have and had always needed other people to exercise on his behalf. They were not easy children. They argued with each other and with their parents, and occasionally with neighboring children, in ways that required adult intervention and apology, and they broke things and forgot things and made decisions that their parents had to help them understand the consequences of, and they were, in all these ways. Completely normal human children growing up on a working ranch where the work was real, and the consequences of errors were also real. Silas taught them what he knew. He taught them that ground tells you what it needs. If you pay attention, that fence posts rot from the bottom up, and you have to look below the surface to know the truth of what's standing. That water always finds the low point, and your only choice is whether you've planned for that or are surprised by it. He taught them that tools maintained carefully outlast tools maintained carelessly by decades, and that the difference between a mortise joint and a nail is not just structural, but a statement about what you believe the thing you're building deserves. He taught them that the most important conversations happen when you're doing something else with your hands, because people talk straighter when they're not looking directly at each other. Eliza taught them things Silas couldn't have taught, because they weren't things he knew. She taught them to read with the appetite of someone who understands that other people's thinking is a resource rather than a competition. She taught them to ask a question and then actually listen to the answer rather than waiting for their own turn to speak. She taught them that sentiment is not the same as weakness, that caring about things doesn't disqualify your judgment about them, it informs it, and anyone who tells you otherwise is usually someone who benefits from your detachment. She taught Clara in particular that a woman who knows what she thinks and says so directly is not difficult, she is honest, and the people who find that difficult are telling you something useful about themselves. Clara grew up to understand this with a completeness that occasionally alarmed even Eliza. Harlan Whitlock came to Sunday dinner at the 40-acre ranch for the better part of a decade, riding out from Red Willow with the same reliability he brought to everything. He got older at the ranch the way old men get older on familiar ground slowly, without particular drama, as if the familiarity itself was providing a kind of structural support. He played a limited but genuine role in the raising of his grandchildren, which mostly consisted of sitting with them on the west-facing porch and saying very few words that nevertheless appeared to carry weight, a skill that John in particular absorbed and Thomas found bewildering. He died in 1892, quietly, in his sleep, in the main house at Red Willow. He was 70 years old and had, by any reasonable measure, spent those years well. Silas and Eliza were with him in the final weeks, trading off the long nights. And it was on one of those nights, a February night with ice on the window glass and the fire going in the main house fireplace, that Harlan said the last thing to Silas he ever said directly. He said, "You built something right." Silas thought at first he meant the 40 acres, the house, the ranch. Then he looked at the old man's face and understood he meant something larger than that. "You helped," Silas said. "Some," Harlan said. "You did the building." He slept after that and didn't say much more in the days remaining, and Silas sat with him through the last of those nights and thought about the Sunday morning. Harlan had come to the equipment shed to talk about post-oak shelves with mortise joints, and the coffee he'd handed Silas on the front steps, and the way he'd walked out of Cole Pruitt's kitchen without making anything sentimental of what he'd just done, and the single sentence he'd offered about Eliza's mother and what she'd believed about building things. And he thought that sometimes the most important things a person does are the things they do quietly, without needing them acknowledged. Red Willow came to Eliza and by extension to both of them after Harlan's death. It was in his will, clearly and without complication, which was how Harlan had done everything. They kept the ranch operating and hired a manager for the day-to-day running of it, because the 40 acres had by then grown into something that required their attention in full 120 acres, with a herd of 60 in the county for producing cattle that were sound and well managed and priced accordingly. The 40 had expanded in stages, each stage a decision they'd made together, with the same arguing through to resolution process they'd been using since the creek boundary dispute in their first spring. They'd bought the adjacent 20 acres in 1887 from a family moving to California, and the 60 acres to the north in 1890 when the family holding it had a bad year and needed liquidity faster than the land bank could provide it. Silas paid them a fair price, not a distressed price, because he'd been on the side of needing help and knew the difference between someone offering a hand and someone offering terms that take advantage of urgency. The man who'd sold him the 60 acres, a rancher named Dobbins, thanked him for it years later in the Dry Creek General Store in front of his wife and 2 of his grown children. He said Silas Mercer had treated him like a man rather than a transaction, and that he hadn't forgotten it. Silas shook his hand and didn't say much, because he was not built for those moments. But he thought about it later, and thought that this was one of the things nobody tells you when you're spending 20 years, with your face to the wind on other people's land, that the way you do things when you don't have to do them carefully is the record that follows you, and eventually it becomes the reputation you leave behind. He'd spent 20 years building a reputation for being dependable. He'd spent another 10 building a reputation for being honest and fair. He was not sure which would outlast him longer. He suspected they were the same thing, finally, just seen from different angles. Bramble died in the spring of 1891, which was the particular grief of losing something that has been reliable for so long that its reliability has become invisible until it's absent. The horse was 23, which was old for a working animal, and he had slowed considerably in his last 2 years, but had maintained his stubbornness and his instincts and his particular way of communicating impatience by shifting his weight with unnecessary drama. Silas buried him in the south pasture, in the place where the grass was richest, with the help of John, who was 6 and understood only that the horse was very old, and that this was sad, and that his father was not himself for several days afterward. Silas didn't explain the horse's full history to John at the time, the 20 years of travel, the bunkhouses. The specific morning he'd saddled Bramble before sunrise to leave Red Willow forever, because 6 was not old enough for that history, and also because Silas was not yet ready to put those particular words in order. He told Clara when she was 12 and asking about the stone marker in the south pasture. He told her the whole of it, the saddlebags under the bunk, the 6 days he'd left them there, Roy Deakins and Clara Hobbs from Amarillo, the morning he'd saddled Bramble to leave, and the morning he'd turned around. Clara listened to all of it with the focused attention she'd inherited from both of them. "You almost didn't come back," she said, "almost. What changed your mind?" He thought about it. He'd thought about it many times and had several answers, all of which were true in different ways. Roy's story, Eliza's voice on the fence line, Harlan's coffee on the front steps. The weight of the saddlebags under the bunk, the specific image of Roy Deakins eating lunch alone at 54 against a fence post on someone else's land with a regret he'd carried for over 20 years. But there was something beneath all of those things, something simpler. "I finally understood," he said, "that I'd built a wall around myself and told myself it was a fence line. That I'd decided what I deserved and what I didn't, and I'd made that decision for everyone else at the same time." He looked at his daughter. "I thought I was being practical, being responsible, not reaching for things I hadn't earned." He paused. "But I wasn't. I was just afraid, and I was calling the fear something that sounded better." Clara looked at the marker in the south pasture. "What were you afraid of?" she asked. He thought about that one, honestly. "That I'd try and be wrong about what I was worth," he said. "That I'd let someone else decide that, and they'd decide against me." He looked at his daughter. "It's easier to decide against yourself ahead of time. Hurts less, seems like it anyway." "Does it?" Clara asked. She was 12, and this was a genuine question. "No," he said. "Roy Deakins could tell you about that." Clara looked at the stone marker for another moment. "You named me after the woman he didn't go back for," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd figured it. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. "Does he know?" "No." She nodded slowly. "You should tell him," she said. "He's old enough that you should tell him while you still can." He looked at his 12-year-old daughter and thought that the particular honesty Eliza had put into her was sometimes startling in its completeness. He told Roy Deakins the following Sunday. Roy had come to Sunday dinner, which had become a habit at some point in the past few years. Roy's Sunday presence at the Mercer table, having transitioned from occasional guest to something closer to fixed arrangement. The way things transition, when everyone has quietly agreed they're better with the arrangement than without it. After dinner, when the children had gone to do whatever children do after Sunday dinner, and Eliza had taken Harlan's old habit of going to look at the pasture in the evening light, Silas told Roy about the name. Straight the way he said things, Roy was quiet for a long time. He looked at his coffee cup. "Clara," he said finally. "The name, just the name." Yes, Eliza agreed to that. "It was her idea," Silas said. "She knew the story. She thought it was right." Roy turned the cup in his hands. He was 62 now. The same face weathered further, the same missing finger joint, the same economy of expression that communicated more than most people's full effort. "That's something," he said finally. It was not a long sentence. But Roy Deakins had never used long sentences when short ones would carry the weight, and this one carried more than Silas knew how to measure, and he didn't try. And they sat in the comfortable silence of two men who understand each other well enough not to need to fill everything. The empty shelf in the main room was still empty in 1,895 12 years after Eliza had put it there. Silas had stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing something that has always been in a particular place. Then, one evening in November, he came in from the last fence check of the day and found Eliza standing in front of the shelves with something in her hands. It was a journal. Her own, he realized, the kind she'd been keeping for years, filled in the cramped, precise handwriting she used when she was thinking something through rather than writing for someone else. "There are 4 of them now," she said. She had the newest one in her hand. "I've been keeping them since the year we moved in." She looked at the empty shelf. Then she set the journal on it, not all 4, just the one. "For now," she said, "the others when I fill them." He looked at the journal on the shelf, at the space beside it, waiting for the ones that would come. "You always said you'd know when you found the right thing," he said. "I did know," she said. "I just wasn't ready to say it was this yet." He looked at her. "It's us," she said simply. "That's what goes on the shelf. What we thought, what we figured out, what we decided to believe about things." She looked at the journal. "I want the children to have it when we're gone, not what we owned. What we thought." He stood beside her and looked at the shelf, the post-oak shelf with mortise joints that he'd built in a house he'd built on ground that had been someone else's and was now their own, with the books she'd organized and the empty space she'd held for something not yet found, and the journal that was the beginning of what she'd found it for. He thought about a man who spends 20 years repairing other men's fences and believes that's the shape his life is supposed to take. He thought about the invisible boundary he'd built around his own life and called reasonable, called practical, called fair. He thought about Roy Deakins at 54 eating lunch against a fence post with a regret 20 years old, and about Warren Blackwell saying he hoped Silas understood what he was taking on, and about Harlan Whitlock handing him a cup of coffee on the front steps of a house that wasn't his and choosing not to say all the things he could have said. He thought about Eliza riding out to the eastern fence line on a Thursday morning with a canteen she handed him because she'd been paying attention to how he drank his coffee and had decided that attention was worth acting on. He thought about the morning he'd saddled Bramble to leave and the morning he'd turned around, and about the specific distance between those 2 mornings, not time, not miles, but something else. Something that had more to do with the invisible fences a person builds around what they believe they're allowed to want. He'd spent the first 40 years of his life on the wrong side of that fence. He'd spent the next 12 years understanding that the most useful thing he'd ever built was the courage to tear it down. That was the thing nobody put on a deed. Nobody filed it at the county courthouse. Nobody could take it from you if times got hard and you had to sell the cattle, or let the hired hand go, or take a bad year on the chin and start the next one shorter than you'd planned. What a man builds inside himself the willingness to be seen honestly, to work without guarantee, to offer what he actually has instead of apologizing for what he doesn't that doesn't depreciate. That doesn't rot from the bottom up while you're looking at the surface. That is the one thing Silas Mercer had figured out late and used well and would have told anyone who asked if anyone had thought to ask him. Most people didn't think to ask a man like him, which was fine. He had Eliza to tell things to, and Roy Deakins for when the telling needed to be short, and 3 children who were growing into the specific shape of what their parents had chosen to be when choosing had been required. And he had 40 acres that were his, with grass thick enough in the south pasture to mark a good horse's grave, and a west-facing porch where the afternoon shade came at exactly the right time, and a set of post-oak shelves with mortise joints that held what a family had thought and learned and decided to believe, and one shelf that had been empty for 12 years and was empty no longer. The most important fence he ever fixed was the invisible one. He had built it himself, post by post, the way you build something you believe in. And unlike the fences he'd spent 20 years repairing for other men, this one, when he finally took it down, he never rebuilt again.